Hey, how's it going? How's it going? How's it going? Some more. It's Politics with Laura here. Oh, the United Nations Security Council has come together on Monday. Monday, here in New York City, convening about what is going on in Venezuela. It is, I never seen them move so fast. I truly have never seen them move that fast before. It is, for me, beyond comprehension. Wow. Now, Somalia is the president of the UN Security Council for this month. So it seems like every month a different country has an opportunity to be over the Security Council. And there is just a lot to be said, a lot going on. Now, so let's go ahead and take a listen to what these countries have to say about Donald Trump invading Venezuela, taking President Maduro and his wife out of Venezuela to New York City in the 5th District, Southern 5th District. So let's go ahead and get into it and then have some final thoughts. Now, this is going to be a long live stream. This right here is not for the faint-hearted. This is for the hardcore political people that are in their country politics and also the politics around the world and how it affects them. So let me see. Bring this up. Wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. Okay, here it is. All right. So here we go.
To Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today, I'm going to deliver a statement from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was not able to be here this morning. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, we meet at a grave time following the 3 January United States military action in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The broad outlines of the events of Saturday have been widely reported. Early that day, U.S. forces were active across Caracas and in the northern states of Miranda, Aragua, and La Guaira. The extent of casualties resulting from these actions remains undetermined. In a statement on social media on Saturday, President Donald Trump announced the conduct of a, I quote, large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolas Maduro, end quote. During a press conference on Saturday, President Trump stated, "We are," and I quote again, "we are going to run the country until such time that we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition," end quote. The government of Venezuela has characterized the United States action as a military aggression carried out in civilian and military areas and as a flagrant violation of the Charter, posing a threat to international and regional peace and security. As we speak, President Maduro is being held in New York, accused by U.S. authorities, along with his wife, Celia Flores, of serious criminal offenses. What is less certain is the immediate future of Venezuela. I am deeply concerned about the possible intensification of the instability in the country, the potential impact on the region, and the precedent it may set for how relations between and among states are conducted. Mr. President, the situation in Venezuela has been a matter of regional and international concern for many years now. Attention on the country only grew following the contested presidential elections in July 2024. The panel of electoral experts I appointed at the Venezuelan government's request to accompany the elections highlighted serious issues. We have consistently called for the full transparency and the complete publication of the results of the elections. As reported to the Council on 23 December, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has cataloged serious violations. On 3 January, Venezuelan interim President Delcy Rodriguez invoked an emergency decree throughout the national territory, extending additional security powers to the government. Mr. President, the latest developments follow a period of heightened tensions beginning in mid-August, as discussed in this Council on 2 previous occasions. I have consistently stressed the imperative of full respect by all for international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, which provides the foundation for the maintenance of international peace and security. I remain deeply concerned that rules of international law have not been respected with regard to the 3 January military action. The Charter enshrines the prohibition of the threat or use of force, political independence of any state. The maintenance of international peace and security depends on the continued commitment of all member states to adhere to all the provisions of the Charter. Mr. President, Venezuela has experienced decades of internal instability and social and economic turmoil. Democracy has been undermined. Millions of its people have fled the country. The situation is critical, but it is still possible to prevent a wider and more destructive conflagration. I call on all Venezuelan actors to engage in an inclusive, democratic dialogue in which all sectors of society can determine their future. This entails the full respect of human rights, the rule of law, and the sovereign will of the Venezuelan people. I also urge Venezuela's neighbors and the international community more broadly to act in a spirit of solidarity and in adherence to the principles, laws, and rules erected to promote peaceful coexistence. I welcome and am ready to support all efforts aimed at assisting Venezuelans in finding a peaceful way forward. Mr. President, Excellencies, in situations as confused as complex as the one we now face, it is important to stick to principles. Respect for the UN Charter and all other applicable legal frameworks to safeguard peace and security. Respect for the principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of states. The prohibition of the threat or use of force. The power of the law must prevail. International law contains tools to address issues such as illicit traffic in narcotics, disputes about resources, and human rights concerns. This is the route we need to take. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefings. I now give the floor to Mr. Jeffrey Sachs.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the issue before the Council today is not the character of the government of Venezuela. The issue is whether any member state, by force, coercion, or economic strangulation, has the right to determine Venezuela's political future or to exercise control over its affairs. This question goes directly to Article 2, Section 4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The Council must decide whether that prohibition is to be upheld or abandoned. Abandoning it would carry consequences of the gravest kind. Let me offer some background. Since 1947, the United States foreign policy has repeatedly employed force, covert action, and political manipulation to bring about regime change in other countries. This is a matter of carefully documented historical record. In her book, Covert Regime Change, political scientist Lindsay O'Rourke documents 70 attempted U.S. regime change operations between 1947 and 1989 alone. These practices did not end with the Cold War. Since 1989, major United States regime change operations undertaken without authorization by the Security Council have included, among the most consequential, Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Syria beginning in 2011, Honduras 2009, Ukraine 2014, and Venezuela from 2002 onward. The methods employed are well established and well documented. They include open warfare, covert intelligence operations, instigation of unrest, support for armed groups, manipulation of mass and social media, bribery of military and civilian officials, targeted assassinations, false flag operations, and economic warfare. These measures are illegal under the UN Charter, and they typically result in ongoing violence, lethal conflict, political instability, and deep suffering of the civilian population. The recent US record with respect to Venezuela is also clear. In April 2002, the US knew of and approved an attempted coup against the government. In the 2010s, the United States funded civil society groups actively engaged in anti-government protests. When the government cracked down on the protests, the US followed with a series of sanctions. In 2015, President Barack Obama declared Venezuela to be, and I quote, an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. In 2017, at a dinner with Latin American leaders on the margin of the UN General Assembly, President Trump openly discussed the option of the US invading Venezuela to overthrow the government. During 2017 to 2020, the United States imposed sweeping sanctions on the state oil company PDVSA. Oil production fell by 75% from 2016 to 2020, and the real GDP per capita declined by 62%. The UN General Assembly has repeatedly voted overwhelmingly against such unilateral coercive measures. Under international law, only the Security Council has the authority to impose such measures. On the 23rd of January 2019, the United States unilaterally recognized Mr. Juan Guaido as interim president, and a few days later froze approximately $7 billion of Venezuelan sovereign assets held abroad and gave the designated authority over certain of these assets. These actions form part of a continuous US regime change effort spanning more than 2 decades. In the past year, the United States has carried out bombing operations in 7 countries, none of which were authorized by the UN Security Council, and none of which were undertaken in lawful self-defense under the Charter. The targeted countries include Iran, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and now Venezuela. In the past month, President Trump has issued direct threats against 6 UN member states, including Colombia, Denmark, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, and of course, Venezuela. Members of the Council are not called upon to judge Nicolas Maduro. They are not called upon to assess whether the recent US attack and ongoing naval quarantine results in freedom or in subjugation. Members of the Council are called upon to defend international law, and specifically the UN Charter. The realist school of international relations, articulated most brilliantly by John Mearsheimer, accurately describes the condition of international anarchy as the tragedy of great power politics. Realism is therefore a description, not a solution for peace. Its own conclusion is that anarchy leads to tragedy. In the aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations was created to end the tragedy through the application of international law. Yet the world's leading nations failed to defend international law in the 1930s, leading to renewed global war. The United Nations emerged from that catastrophe as humanity's second great effort to place international law above international anarchy. In the words of the Charter, the UN was created, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Given that we are in the nuclear age, failure cannot be repeated. Humanity would perish. there would be no third chance. To fulfill its responsibilities under the Charter, the Security Council should immediately affirm the following actions. The United States shall immediately cease and desist from all explicit and implicit threats or use of force against Venezuela. The United States shall terminate its naval quarantine and all related coercive military measures undertaken in the absence of authorization by the UN Security Council. The United States shall immediately withdraw its military forces from within and along the perimeter of Venezuela, including intelligence, naval, air, and other forward deployed assets positioned for coercive purposes. Venezuela shall adhere to the UN Charter and to the human rights protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Secretary General, I recommend, should immediately appoint a special envoy mandated to engage relevant Venezuelan and international stakeholders and to report back to the Security Council within 14 days with recommendations consistent with the Charter, and the Security Council should remain urgently seized of this matter. All member states should refrain from unilateral threats, coercive measures, or armed actions undertaken outside the authority of the UN Security Council. In closing, Mr. President and distinguished members of the Council, peace and the survival of humanity depend on whether the United Nations Charter remains a living instrument of international law or is allowed to wither into irrelevance. That is the choice before this Council today. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Sachs for his briefings. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. My apology. I now give the floor to Ms. Mercedes de Freitas.
Now you're going to find a little technical difficulty, but still continue because what she has to say is
Good morning.
important.
I speak in Spanish. Please give the translation. Buenos días, embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de estados y
ambassadors,
gobiernos. Gracias
representatives
por esta
of
oportunidad.
states and governments. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak.
Sí, sí, no me escuchan.
Can you hear me?
Aló, aló, ¿me
Can you
escuchan?
hear me?
¿Me
We can
escuchan?
hear you,
Disculpa,
yeah.
ya estoy aquí. Excuse me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. I speak in Spanish. Buenos días, señores embajadores,
Good morning,
representantes de
ambassadors,
estados.
representatives
Gracias por esta
of
oportunidad
heads of
de
state and
presentar los
government.
resultados
Thank
de
you
investigaciones que
to
desde Transparencia
enable me to
Venezuela
tell you something about Transparency
hemos estado
Venezuela,
desarrollando para
the work that we have been doing.
para la okay. He organizado
We have organized
la información que voy a presentar
I've
en 5 puntos.
I've organized some information I'm going to put forward to you in 5 points.
¿Cómo puedo bajar el volumen? Bueno, he
Continue.
organizado la información que voy a presentarles en 5 puntos.
I've
para
arranged the
aprovechar los
information I'm
pocos
going
minutos que
to
tengo.
give to you in
Punto
around
número
5
uno.
points. Let me make
La
the
red de
most of my
gran
time.
corrupción
First of
transnacional
all,
de origen
one,
venezolano
the
tiene presencia con empresas,
corruption in
propiedades y actividades en
Venezuela
73
sees
países del mundo.
is seen in some 3 countries of the world. We have organized, we've seen hundreds of cases that we have documented over the years, more than 500, 600 cases in various countries.
Continue. We can hear you. Go ahead. Continue. Can you hear us? We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Solo En los sistemas de justicia de 30 países
We looked at the justice
se
systems of
procesaron
30 countries,
172 casos de
and
grave corrupción,
172 cases
donde el
were
60%
dealt
de
with for
ellos
corruption,
suman más de
and
72 mil millones
more
de
than
dólares.
$72 trillion were involved.
Esos 72 millones de dólares que
$1
están
million
comprometidos
were
son
involved.
dinero público venezolano.
This was public
Nicolás
Venezuelan money.
Maduro y su
Nicolas
familia
Maduro and his
son el
family.
Y él cuenta
The interpreter cannot hear
y el
the
de
speaker.
petróleo de Venezuela ha sido el instrumento central, involucrada directa e indirectamente en el 90%
It
de
was a
los casos
system
de
that was
corrupción
involved in
que hemos
90%
identificado.
of the corruption
Punto número
cases.
2.
Point number
Las
2,
organizaciones criminales nacionales
the
y
national
internacionales
criminal
tienen una
organizations.
relación simbiótica con la administración de Nicolás Maduro.
The interpreter cannot hear the speech to provide sufficient interpretation. I
Para
apologize.
facilitar, soportar, proteger y dirigir las operaciones ilícitas. Las economías ilícitas de oro, droga, extorsión y trata de personas alcanzaron en
Miss Freitas,
2024
Miss
8.000
Freitas,
millones de dólares.
can you
según
hear
nuestra
us?
estimación.
Miss Freitas,
De la producción de oro, ¿sí?
can you hear us? The interpreters cannot hear you. Can you slow down and raise your voice a little bit?
Hay un delay.
There's a delay, says the speaker. The problem the interpreter is having is with the quality of the sound, which is insufficient for interpretation.
Sí,
It's not the speed.
Dígame. Sí, la oigo con delay. Sí, sí,
I'm
la oigo.
hearing you, but with a delay, says the
Sí, la
speaker.
escucho.
I can hear you, though.
Okay. Please proceed now.
Ok, perfecto.
Very well.
El punto número 2. Las
Point
organizaciones
2.
criminales nacionales e internacionales
National and international criminal organizations
tienen una relación simbiótica con la
have a
administración de Nicolás
symbiotic
Maduro,
relationship with the
compartiendo
regime of Nicolas
capacidades,
Maduro,
utilizando
sharing
las
capacity,
estructuras del Estado
using the
para
state
facilitar,
structures to facilitate
impulsar, proteger y dirigir
their
las
work
operaciones
and to
ilícitas.
protect
Las
illicit
economías ilícitas
operations
de oro,
in
drogas,
gold, for example,
extorsión
drugs,
y trata de
extortion,
personas,
and human trafficking.
pero según nuestras estimaciones,
And according to our estimates,
8.200.000 millones de dólares.
this
De
accounts
la
for
producción
about
de oro, por
$8
ejemplo, solo se
billion.
reporta el
Gold, for
20%
example,
al
only
Tesoro
20%
Nacional.
is
El
reported
resto
to the
va
national
a
treasury.
cuentas
The rest
privadas
goes to
de
private
miembros
accounts
aliados del
where
alto gobierno.
there are members and allies with the
Ese
government.
proceso minero, además,
This
ha destruido áreas completas de
mining
nuestro estado
industry
Bolívar,
has exploited
del Parque
so
Nacional
many
Canaima
people
y de
using
nuestro Amazonas.
national parks and also
Para
the
lavar el
Amazon
dinero
area.
de la
And then
corrupción
to
y del
launder the
crimen
money from
organizado, la
corruption,
red comparte
the
operaciones
network
y estructuras y mecanismos de lavado de dinero
has
muy
money laundering
sofisticados.
structures that are
Y
very
desde el
sophisticated.
2021
And since
utilizan las
2021,
criptoactivos a gran escala. El punto 3.
they've been involved in this work.
La gran
3,
corrupción y los ilícitos
great
son una de
corruption
las razones de reducción de los ingresos del Estado,
has led to
y
a
por ende
decrease
del
in the
gasto
income
público,
of the
del
state and
empleo de
therefore
calidad,
public
de los servicios
expenditure,
básicos,
and therefore
de la
affecting the
economía
quality of
del país
basic
sigue en crisis
services.
actual desde
The
hace
current
décadas.
economy
Tampoco
is
hay
in
dinero para
crisis.
pagar la
There's
deuda,
no
que hoy
money
suma
either to service the
167
debt.
mil millones de dólares que tiene a Venezuela en cesación de pagos selectivos en
Uh,
un default técnico desde el
although
2017,
Venezuela has been in
donde el primer
technical
acreedor
default
es
since
Chile, al que
2017.
aún le debemos más de 15.000 millones de dólares.
We owe more than
Punto 4.
$15 million.
Los
Four,
venezolanos hemos tenido que aprender a
Venezuelans
vivir
have
con
had to
pocas
learn
horas de
to
luz
live with
en gran
just a
parte del
few
país, de
hours
Caracas,
of
inclusive en las otras ciudades
electricity
del país.
per day in very many
Hay que,
parts of the
hemos
country.
aprendido a protegernos
And we've
de la
learned to
extorsión
protect
diaria
ourselves
y
from
generalizada
daily
desde los grupos
extortion
armados
from the
colombianos, desde los grupos del
from the
crimen
armed Colombian
organizado,
groups or the
pero también
organized crime
lamentablemente
groups, but
desde los funcionarios del Estado.
also
Millones
elements
de
of the
familias
state.
tienen una sola comida al día,
So many
con
families
bajo
only
nivel
have one
calórico.
meal per
Los
day
datos de
below the
desnutrición
calories
y
that they need,
nutrición empeoran
affecting
cada
their
día.
nutrition, which is
Los
getting worse
programas
day by day.
humanitarios no son
Humanitarian
suficientes.
programs are not
Se
sufficient.
eliminó el sistema de contrapesos y la independencia entre los poderes públicos. Ese es mi quinto punto.
And then 5, there's no checks and balances between government departments. The government has captured all institutions, beginning with the justice institutions and also the oil company responsible for the majority of income for the country. In order to maintain control and the impunity of these illicit operations, a repressive system that's getting worse and worse is being applied. And today, there are more than 1,000 political prisoners. At the end of the year, 26 people died during torture or because of a lack of medical care. The United Nations has documented many of these cases. We need a transparent state that is accountable, that will guarantee the rule of law and human rights, that will protect public goods for everyone without privilege, a system that's autonomous and independent. We need investment in building capacity that will enable us to have a dignified life. We must respect the will of the Venezuelan people to live in peace and democracy. And finally, a request to you: freedom for all political prisoners in the country. Thank you very much.
I thank to Ms. Freitas for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
Colombia
would like to thank Somalia in your quality as President of the Security Council for having quickly responded to our request to convene this emergency meeting, as well as thanking China and Russia for their support for holding of this meeting. And we wish you, Mr. President,
una exitosa gestión durante este mes de enero,
a successful month
particularmente delicado
managing the work of the Council at a particularly delicate time for international peace and security. I'd also like to thank Undersecretary General for Political Affairs and Peace Building of the United Nations and the invited briefers. We thank them all for their briefings. This is the first time Colombia is taking the floor in the Security Council as a non-permanent member for the period 2026-2027. Colombia is taking on this responsibility with a deep sense of duty, and we are going to do this from the first day, defending international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. International peace and security, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the prohibition of the use of force, sovereign equality, respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of all states. Colombia condemns categorically the events that occurred in the early morning of the 3rd of January in Venezuela, where we saw multiple explosions and air activity over Caracas and other areas of the country as part of a military attack carried out by the United States, which included bombings of civilian and military infrastructure, creating panic amongst the population. All of this represents clear violations of the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Venezuela. There is no justification whatsoever under any circumstances for the unilateral use of force to commit an act of aggression. Such actions constitute a serious violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition on the use or the threat of the use of force, the principle of the respect for sovereignty sovereignty and the full authority of states over their territory, including their natural resources, the territorial integrity of states, and the principles of collective defense, particularly when they directly endanger the population and civilian assets. Defending these principles is not an option. Indeed, it's a common obligation that we have in order to preserve international peace and security. We need to remember that the provisions of the Charter allow for the use of force only under exceptional circumstances, in legitimate defense in the face of an armed attack, or when there is an express authorization by this Council in accordance with Chapter 7. And even in those cases, this does not amount to assuming political control of another state. In this regard, we reject any unilateral military action, any act that could worsen the situation or endanger the civilian population, and we would call for a de-escalation and non-resort to the use of force, which endangers people finding themselves in this delicate situation. They must be the absolute priority. We have learned from our experience that the civilian population is always the one that pays the highest price in armed conflict. Mr. President, Latin America and the Caribbean have proclaimed themselves to be a zone of peace, and this collective commitment and will of our region must be respected. Unilateral action that is contrary to international law endangers regional stability, increases insecurity, and worsens the already complex conditions being faced by the civilian population, with devastating effects that will transcend the sovereign borders of Venezuela to have a direct impact on countries of the region, such as Colombia. In order to act preventively, Colombia has engaged in measures to protect the civilian population and preserve the stability of the border, addressing the possible needs of the population, particularly the migrant population, in coordination with local authorities. Colombia has been and will continue to be show solidarity in receiving the Venezuelan people who, given the uncertainty created by these attacks, this may lead to a massive outflow of migration, which will require significant efforts in terms of resources and capacities to provide the necessary support and assistance to those areas affected by taking in the migrants. Mr. President, these actions that we have seen remind us of the worst interference in our area in the past, in our zone of peace, and calls to mind the commitment that we have as states to resolve our differences peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly a country that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, What then is the role of this council, and where are the foundations for international peace and security? We are accepting that the law and the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber. Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence or coercion, and it cannot be superseded either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity, and dignity, with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law, and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, good offices available for a diplomatic way out of the current crisis in this brotherly country. We will meet our responsibility, primary responsibility, to maintain international peace and security. And given the seriousness of the events, we will continue to pay attention to this issue. And we'd also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for providing his good offices to defend the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, to activate channels for mediation available to him and facilitate dialogue with the parties concerned, looking in the search for alternatives that will make it possible to find a way out of the situation led by Venezuelans themselves and provide assistance to Venezuelans that need this. In conclusion, we'd urge the parties to exercise maximum caution and restraint, to de-escalate tensions, and to follow dialogue and diplomatic channels, and develop mechanisms to avoid continued flagrant violations of international law. This will require the help of the United Nations and of regional organizations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, first and foremost, we wish to congratulate you on your accession to the presidency of the Security Council. And second, we wish to welcome the newly elected members of the Security Council. The beginning of this new year shocked all of those throughout the world who cherished the hope that respect for international law and non-intervention in domestic affairs of other states, as well as a reliance upon diplomacy and seeking of compromise, became key principles in the work of the new U.S. administration. The assault against the leader of Venezuela, compounded by the deaths of dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban citizens, in the eyes of many, has become a harbinger of a turn back to the era of lawlessness and U.S. domination by force, chaos, and lawlessness, which continues to afflict dozens of states in various regions of the world. There is no and can be no justification for the crimes cynically perpetrated by the United States in Caracas. We firmly condemn the U.S. act of armed aggression against Venezuela in breach of all international legal norms. In connection with the confirmed reports about the presence of the abducted president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, and his spouse in the United States, today, as we are aware, they are in New York, we call upon, corrects the speaker, the U.S. leadership to immediately release the legitimately elected president of an independent state and his spouse. Any problems existing or conflict between the United States and Venezuela need to be resolved through dialogue. And this is precisely what is enshrined in the UN Charter, for purposes and the principles of which a number of states in recent years have begun to apply selectively, depending upon the political landscape. Today, we are reaping the consequences of their recklessness and selectivity in matters related to respect for the norms of international law, which were linked to the so-called rules-based world order. Here is your rules-based world order in all of its glory, which is horrifying even the staunchest Atlanticists. Mr. President, we extend our firm solidarity with the people of Venezuela in the face of the external aggression. We firmly support and completely support the policy of the Bolivarian government, which is geared towards protection of their national interests and the sovereignty of the country. Washington's aggressive acts have already been condemned by many states and multilateral associations, including the Non-Aligned Movement, the African Union, as well as a group of friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We hope that the international banditry will immediately be met with objective and comprehensive assessment at the international legal level with United Nations, universal mechanisms, and other multilateral formats being brought to bear. This process must not be impacted by the recognition or non-recognition by any given states or groups of states of the legitimacy of Nicolas Maduro. For this reason, unintelligible murmurings and attempts to avoid principled assessments by those who, in other circumstances, froth at the mouth and demand that others respect the UN Charter, today seem particularly hypocritical and unseemly. We hope you will recognize this, and we hope that you will abandon double standards and that you will not attempt to justify such an egregious act of aggression due to a fear of angering the American global gendarme, which is attempting to once again rear its head. We are particularly appalled by the unparalleled cynicism with which Washington did not even attempt to conceal the true aims of its criminal operation, namely the establishment of unbridled control over Venezuela's natural resources and the assertion of their hegemonical ambitions in Latin America. In this way, Washington is generating fresh momentum for neocolonialism and for imperialism, which were repeatedly, decisively condemned and repudiated by the peoples of this region and by the global South as a whole. Distinguished colleagues, under these circumstances, it is exceedingly important for the entire international community to unite and to definitively reject the methods and tools of U.S. military foreign policy, which have been demonstrated in the case of Venezuela. This is the only way it is possible to compel Washington to revisit and to abandon their dangerous misconceptions. As we stated during previous meetings on Venezuela, the bell now tolls across the region, ringing for every country of the Western Hemisphere. The bell is ringing for all UN member states and for the future of the organization itself. Failing to hear this call today is tantamount to projecting cowardice and the lack of principle, essentially blessing ongoing encroachments of international law and rejecting civilized international conduct as a whole. We cannot allow the United States to proclaim itself as some kind of a supreme judge which alone bears the right to invade any country, to label culprits, to hand down and to enforce punishments, irrespective of notions of international law, sovereignty, and non-intervention. Is this the world we sought to attain as we marked the 80th anniversary of the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations, when we all signed on to the relevant Security Council presidential statement? Is this the aim of United Nations reform, which we all advocate? Or has the United Nations and Security Council thereof, do they no longer exist? And is there need now to seek from Washington a patent to rule, so to speak? And is the self-determination of every person's and their right to determine their future worthless? These are the questions that we all must address today. And if this response is sincere, if it is principled, then perhaps the U.S. leadership too, which openly is asserting intention to run another country for the benefit of the United States, they will perhaps glance at their own constitution, their constitution of the United States, which begins with the words, "We the people of the United States," and will begin, in fact, to recognize the sovereignty of other states rather than deposing inconvenient regimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President,
中方支持安理会
supports the Security
就美
Council
国对委内瑞
holding
拉
an emergency
发动
meeting
军事打
regarding the
击
United
召开
States
紧急会
military
议。
strikes on Venezuela.
感谢迪卡洛副
And
秘书长
thanks USG
宣读古特雷
DiCarlo
斯秘
for
书长
reading
的通
out
报。
the briefing of the Secretary
我
General
认真听
Guterres.
取了
I
通
have
报人的
listened
发言，
carefully to the statements of the
欢迎委内
briefers,
瑞拉常驻
and
代
we
表
welcome to this
和其他
meeting
国
the
家代
permanent
表
representative
出席
of
会议。
Venezuela and representatives of other
1月3
countries.
日，美
On
国悍
January
然
the
对委
3rd,
内瑞
the
拉
United
发动
States
大规模
blatantly
军事打
launched
击，
large-scale military
强
strikes
行控制
against
委内瑞
Venezuela,
拉总统马杜
forcibly
罗及
seized
其夫人，
Venezuelan
并
President
移
Nicolas
送出境，
Maduro and his wife
宣称
and
将
took them
管理
out
委
of
内
the
瑞拉，
country. It
甚
claimed
至不排
that it
除
will
实
run
施第二
Venezuela
轮
and even
规模更
didn't
大的
rule out
军事
launching
行
a
动。
second round of military operations
中
on
方
an
对美
even
方的
larger
单边
scale.
非法
China
霸
is
凌行
deeply
径
shocked
深表震
by
惊，
and strongly
予以
condemns
强
the
烈谴责。
unilateral, illegal, and bullying acts of the
一段时间
U.S.
以来，
For some
国际社
time
会
now,
多次
the
对美
international
方针
community
对
has
委内瑞拉的
repeatedly
制
expressed
裁封
grave
锁
concern
和武力
over the
威胁
U.S.
表示
sanctions,
强烈担
blockade,
忧。
and threats of force against
安理会召
Venezuela.
开2次
The
紧急
Council
会议，
convened 2 emergency
古特雷
meetings,
斯秘书长、
during which
广大安理会
Secretary
成
General
员、
Guterres,
地区
many
国家
Council
和域外
members,
国家
and countries
一
in
致
the
呼吁
region and
遵
beyond
守联合国宪章
unanimously called
和
for
国际
abiding
法，
by the UN Charter
保持
and the
冷静
international
克制，
law, maintaining
和
calm
平
and
解决争端，
restraint, resolving
推动军
disputes
事降级，
peacefully,
维护
de-escalating
地区稳
tensions,
定。
and safeguarding regional
然而，
stability. However,
美国作为
as a
安理
permanent
会
member of
常
the
任理事国，
Council, the
无视
U.S.
国际社
has
会严
disregarded
重
the
关切，
grave concerns of the
肆意践
international
踏委
community,
内瑞拉主权、
wantonly
安
trampled
全
upon
和合法
Venezuela's
权益，
sovereignty,
严重违
security,
反
and legitimate
主
rights
权
and
平等
interests,
原则，
and seriously violated the
严重违
principles
反
of
不干
sovereign
涉内政
equality,
原则，
non-interference in internal
严重违
affairs,
反和平解决
peaceful
国际
settlement
争
of
端原则，
international disputes,
严重违反
and
在
the
国际关系中
prohibition of
不
the
得
use
使用
of
武力原
force
则。
in international relations.
这些原则
These
是联合国
principles
宪章的根
constitute
本要
the
义，
fundamental tenets of the UN
构成了
Charter
维护
and
国际和平
form
与安
the
全的基
cornerstone
石。
of maintaining international peace and
美方将自
security.
身强权
The U.S.
凌驾
has
于
placed its
多
own
边主义之
power
上，
above multilateralism
将军事
and
行动
military
凌驾于
action
外
above
交努力之上，
diplomatic efforts,
严重威胁
posing a
拉美
grave
和加勒
threat
比地
to
区
peace and
乃至国
security
际
in
和
Latin
平与安
America
全。
and the Caribbean, and
中方对
indeed
此坚决反对，
internationally. China
国际社
firmly
会也
opposes
普遍
this,
表
and the
示严
international
重关切，
community has also
予
expressed
以强
widespread
烈谴
grave
责。
concern and strong condemnation.
我们敦促美方
We urge the
正视
U.S.
国际社
to
会
heed
压倒性
the
呼声，
overwhelming voice of the
遵
international
守国际法
community,
及联合国
abide
宪
by
章宗旨
international law
和原
and the
则，
purposes and principles of the
停
UN
止侵犯
Charter,
别国主权、
cease
安全，
infringing upon the
停止
sovereignty
颠
and
覆
security
委
of
内瑞
other
拉政
countries,
权，
stop toppling the
回归
government
通
of
过对话谈
Venezuela,
判
and
政治解
return
决
to the
问题的
path
轨道
of。political solutions through dialogue and negotiations. We call on the U.S. to ensure the personal safety of President Maduro and his wife and to release them at once. We support the Council in fulfilling its primary responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and we support all efforts by the UN Secretary General, regional countries, and organizations that contribute to promoting dialogue and de-escalating the situation. President, the lessons of history are a stark warning. Military means are not the solution to problems, and the indiscriminate use of force will only lead to greater crisis. The U.S. bypassed the Council to launch military operations against Iraq, blatantly attacked Iran's nuclear facilities, and imposed economic sanctions, military strikes, and even armed occupations on multiple countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. These actions have caused persistent conflict, instability, and immense suffering for the ordinary people. Did these actions bring peace and stability? Did they bring development and prosperity? The international community sees this clearly. Venezuela is an independent sovereign state with every right to defend its sovereignty and national dignity. Countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are important forces in maintaining world peace and stability and promoting global development and prosperity, and they have every right to independently choose their development paths and partners. No country can act as the world's police, nor can any state presume to be the international judge. China firmly supports the government and people of Venezuela in safeguarding their sovereignty, security, and legitimate rights and interests. We firmly support the regional countries in upholding the status of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. We demand that the United States change its course, cease its bullying and coercive practices, and develop relations in cooperation with regional countries on the basis of mutual respect, equality, and non-interference in international affairs. China stands ready to work with the regional countries and the international community to strengthen solidarity and cooperation, uphold fairness and justice, and jointly safeguard peace and stability in Latin America and the Caribbean. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3 members, namely the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, and my own country, Liberia. We thank the presidency for promptly convening this important meeting. We congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month and warmly welcome all new members. The A3 appreciates USG DiCarlo's comprehensive briefing and listened carefully to the remarks offered by civil society representatives. We also welcome the representative of Venezuela and the representatives of the region to this meeting. Mr. President, the A3 aligns itself with the recent communique of the African Union on the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and continues to monitor developments there with deep concerns. In particular, we note reports regarding the detention of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife and incidents involving Venezuelan institutions. Such developments present serious challenges not only to Venezuela's internal stability, but also underscore the imperative to safeguard the broader peace and security of the region. The A3 remains steadfast in its commitment to the fundamental principles of international law, including the full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations in the interest of regional stability and international peace. We believe these are essential foundations for international cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Our position underscores the importance of dialogue, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and respect for constitutional and institutional frameworks. Mr. President, the complex situation in Venezuela requires a comprehensive response that is both inclusive and nationally owned. We continue to hold that a sustainable and peaceful resolution can only be found through constructive dialogue among Venezuelans themselves, with genuine respect for the aspiration and rights of the Venezuelan people, and with the constructive support of the international community. The A3 expresses its solidarity with the people of Venezuela and reiterates the African Union's commitment to peace, stability, and mutual respect among nations and regions. It's important for all parties, both within Venezuela and in the broader international community, to exercise restraint and responsibility, upholding international law and avoiding any action that could escalate tension or threaten regional stability. The A3 stands ready to support all efforts within this council and in cooperation with regional partners to facilitate a peaceful, inclusive, and lasting resolution to the situation in Venezuela. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liberia for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you for chairing. And I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Freitas, for your briefing. And I'll point out that Mr. Freitas is in exile, having fled the regime. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for shedding a light on the true atrocities of the illegitimate Maduro regime. This past weekend, colleagues, the United States successfully carried out a surgical law enforcement operation facilitated by the U.S. military against two indicted fugitives of American justice, narco-terrorist Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores. Colleagues, Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation in furtherance of lawful indictments that have existed for decades. The United States arrested a narco trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years. A similar action was taken in 1989 against Manuel Noriega. He was arrested, indicted, convicted in a court of law, served in prison in the United States and in Panama, and the Panamanian people, the American people, are safer for it. And undeniably, the region was more stable. This law enforcement action was directed consistent with the President of the United States' responsibility as Commander-in-Chief to protect Americans at home and abroad against a fugitive who is directly responsible for narcoterrorism that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans and created destabilizing violence throughout our hemisphere. Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendant, Celia Flores, have been transferred here to the United States to stand trial for their crimes. Maduro was indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York and faces very serious criminal charges for his involvement in a wide-ranging conspiracy to conduct narcoterrorism, to traffic cocaine and other drugs, and conducting international weapons trafficking. The overwhelming evidence of his crimes will be presented openly in U.S. court proceedings. Colleagues, Maduro is not just an indicted drug trafficker. He was an illegitimate so-called president. He was not a head of state. For years, Maduro and his cronies have manipulated Venezuela's electoral system to maintain their illegitimate grip on power. In fact, just 2 years ago in 2024, a UN panel of experts report found that the election in that year was absolutely and completely a farce and fell well short of the most basic transparency and integrity measures essential to upholding credible elections. If the UN and the United Nations in this body confers legitimacy on an illegitimate narco-terrorist and the same treatment in this charter of a democratically elected president or head of state, what kind of organization is this? We should note that over 50 countries, many nations, including the European Union, including a number of Latin American countries in the region, and of course the United States, again, over 50 countries rejected the legitimacy of Maduro's re-election following the disputed 2024 elections and do not recognize him as Venezuela's legitimately elected president. Maduro unlawfully refused to peacefully cede power after the Venezuelan people voted him out of office in the 2024 election. So therefore, Maduro was a fugitive from justice. He is the head of a vicious foreign terrorist organization, Cartel de los Soles. This regime-sponsored enterprise coordinates with and relies on other vicious criminal organizations, namely Tren de Aragua, again, among others, to carry out its objective of using illegal narcotics as a weapon against the United States. And for its part, Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization with thousands of members, many of whom have unlawfully infiltrated the United States and are conducting irregular warfare and undertaking hostile actions against the American people and against the United States. It's terrorizing criminals commit brutal crimes, including murders, kidnappings, extortions, and human, drug, and weapons trafficking. This administration, President Trump, will not stand for it. In fact, in March of 2025, President Trump declared that Tren de Aragua is undertaking, quote, Tren de Aragua is undertaking hostile actions and conducting irregular warfare against the territory of the United States, both directly and at the direction, clandestine or otherwise, of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Maduro and his cronies have partnered with some of the most violent and prolific drug traffickers and narco-terrorists in the world for decades, facilitating the flood of illegal drugs coming in the United States, estimated to be several hundred tons annually. He has become rich, incredibly wealthy, off the misery of untold numbers of Americans, Venezuelans, and others, aiding and abetting international terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, coordinating with corrupt Iranian officials and other malign actors to influence not only the region, but to malignly influence the United States. In fact, in its own 2025 World Drug Report, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime identified Venezuela as a key trafficking route in the Western Hemisphere, the illegal drugs, predominantly cocaine, entering the United States and increasingly Europe. As Secretary Rubio stated just yesterday, this is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live. And we're not going to allow the Western Hemisphere to be used as a base of operation for our nation's adversaries and competitors and rivals of the United States. You can't turn Venezuela into the operating hub for Iran, for Hezbollah, for gangs, for Cuban intelligence agents, and other malign actors that control that country. You cannot continue to have the largest energy reserves in the world under the control of adversaries of the United States, under the control of illegitimate leaders, and not benefiting the people of Venezuela, and stolen by a handful of oligarchs inside of Venezuela. But it doesn't stop there. Numerous UN and international human rights organizations have issued reports documenting serious human rights abuses by the Maduro regime, including reports of extrajudicial killings, political prisoners, torture, and arbitrary and unlawful detentions. In fact, over 8 million Venezuelans have fled the country, destabilizing their neighbors in the region and creating the world's largest refugee crisis. Members of this council, colleagues, the United States wants a better future for Venezuela. We believe a better future for the people of Venezuela and for the people of the region and the world is stabilizing the region and making the neighborhood that we live in a much better and safer place. And this is why millions of Venezuelans that have fled this brutal regime are celebrating and cheering around the world as this body pontificates, including those celebrating are including in my home state of Florida, where hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have fled this regime's brutality. I want to reiterate, President Trump gave diplomacy a chance. He offered Maduro multiple off-ramps. He tried to de-escalate. Maduro refused to take them. President Trump made it clear that the narco-terrorism must stop, and yet it continued. The United States will not waver in our actions to protect Americans from the scourge of narco-terrorism and seeks peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Extendemos la más cordial bienvenida
I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the representatives of Bahrain, Colombia, Liberia, Latvia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and who have joined the Security Council as elected members and who are joining us today in the chamber. And we congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the Security Council this month. I'd like to thank the Secretary General for Political Affairs, Rosemarie DiCarlo, for her detailed report representing Secretary General Antonio Guterres. She's briefed us on the situation under discussion today. We're also very grateful for the very valuable presentations by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. In this context, the Republic of Panama would like to refer to the situation that has taken place in the territory of the Baharain Republic of Venezuela, which is of concern due to its possible impact on peace and regional stability. However, in the light of the unfortunate reality of the facts that we've seen, we now need to turn our attention constructively towards the future of Venezuela. However, it's important to point out that in terms of a constant principle of our foreign policy, Panama would like to reiterate our unfailing commitment to multilateralism, to the sovereignty of states, and to the unrestricted respect for international law, especially the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter, including non-intervention, respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force. This is mentioned in Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. These principles are, and they continue to be, the indispensable framework for the peaceful coexistence between nations. Panama also believes it's necessary to highlight that the situation Venezuela is facing is unfolding in an environment marked by the disregard for the will of its people, as well as by a sustained erosion of democratic institutions. In this regard, Panama reiterates that it does not and will not recognize the authoritarian and illegitimate regime that has held Venezuelan men and women hostage, plunged them into one of the gravest political, social, humanitarian, and security crises in our region. Unfortunately, we have witnessed how the situation has gradually deteriorated under the regime, especially over the last year, with increased systemic erosion of democracy, the hollowing out of institutions, and the rise of authoritarian and repressive practices, which have contributed to an unfortunate outcome and therefore cannot be ignored by the international community. In particular, it is essential to call for the unconditional release of persons detained for political reasons. Many of them have been deprived of their liberty merely for raising their voices in a context in which dissent is not tolerated. From this moment on, we must demand that all political prisoners that the regime continues to hold hostage, Venezuelans and foreigners alike, be released without delay. Their physical well-being and safety must be guaranteed. Likewise, freedom of expression and the unequivocal respect for human rights must be immediately ensured. In this context, Panama underscores that its position does not stem solely from a principled democratic solidarity, but also from direct impact. A Panamanian citizen, Mr. Olmedo Núñez, remains arbitrarily detained in Venezuela without formal charges, without due process, without full access to a defense, and without effective consular guarantees. Added to this is the human impact of a multidimensional crisis that has forced around 9 million Venezuelans, men and women, to leave their homes, compelled to live in displacement and vulnerability as a consequence of the institutional and social collapse generated by the regime. A crisis that has had significant regional repercussions, reflected both in the irregular migration flows from south to north of a significant number of Venezuelan nationals, as well as reverse migration movements, including also a lot of Venezuelans, the effects of which are felt particularly in countries of transit and destination that this affects, including Panama. And this has decisively contributed
Frente a esta
to
realidad,
illegal migration.
Panamá realiza
In the
un
face of this
llamado
reality,
claro
Panama
y
issues a
firme
clear and
a que el
firm
futuro de
call
Venezuela
for
a corto plazo
Venezuela's
sea
short-term
plenamente
future to
democrático.
be fully democratic.
El poder emana del pueblo.
Power
Como
emanates
ha
from the
señalado el
people, and
excelentísimo
as
señor
stated by His
presidente de la
Excellency,
República
the
de Panamá,
President of the Republic
José
of
Raúl
Panama,
Mulino,
José Raúl
el
Molino,
pueblo,
the
el
people,
verdadero soberano,
the true
ya
sovereign,
habló en las urnas,
have already
otorgando un
spoken at
triunfo
the polls,
indiscutible
granting an
con
indisputable
70%
victory
de los
with
votos el
70%
pasado
of the
28 de
votes
julio
on
de
July 28,
2024
2024,
al candidato de
to
oposición,
the
don
opposition
Edmundo
candidate,
González
Mr.
Urrutia,
Edmundo González
así como a María
Urrutia,
Corina
as well as
Machado,
to Maria
quien fue la
Corina
la
Machado,
candidata
who
impedida por
was
el régimen
prevented
a
by the
pesar de haber
regime
ganado la primaria con el 93%
from
de
running,
los
despite
votos
having won the
el 22
primary
de
with
octubre de
93% of the
2023.
votes on October 22nd,
Adicionalmente,
2023.
la popularidad de ambos ha
Additionally,
más
the
bien aumentado en
popularity
los
of both
últimos
has
meses,
increased in recent months,
incluso entre sectores
including among
policiales y
police and
militares.
military
El
sectors.
gobierno electo
The elected
cuenta con los
government
equipos y programas de
has the
trabajo
teams
listos para
and
ser
work
implementados
programs
de
ready to
inmediato
be implemented
para
immediately,
garantizar una
guaranteeing
transición
an
ordenada
orderly
que
transition
provea
that
Estado de Derecho,
provides the rule of
respeto a los
law,
derechos humanos
respect for
y
human
confianza.
rights, and
En
confidence.
coherencia con este compromiso,
In line with this
Panamá
commitment,
custodia con
Panama
orgullo las
proudly
actas electorales que
safeguards
acreditan
the
de manera
electoral
fehaciente dicha
records that
victoria
reliably
como
certify said
testimonio del
victory
derecho
as
inalienable
testimony
del
to the
pueblo venezolano
inalienable right
a
of the
decidir
Venezuelan
su
people
propio
to
destino político.
determine their own political
Reconocer
destiny.
otra autoridad
Recognizing
distinta
any
al presidente
authority
electo
other than that of the
equivaldría
elected
a
president would
a
amount to
legitimar un fraude
legitimizing
electoral,
electoral fraud,
normalizar el autoritarismo
normalizing
y socavar el
authoritarianism,
principio
and
universal
undermining the
de las
universal
elecciones
principle
libres
of free
como fuente de
elections
legitimidad.
as the source of
De igual
legitimacy.
forma, cualquier intento de
Likewise,
establecer un
any
gobierno
attempt to
permanente
establish a
encabezado por
permanent government
figuras
headed
del
by figures
aparato
from
represivo
the repressive
como Delcy
apparatus,
Rodríguez
such as Delcy
constituiría
Rodriguez,
una continuidad
would
del
constitute
sistema y
continuity
no
of the
una
system and
transición
not
genuina.
a genuine transition.
Toda salida política
Any
debe
political
ser
solution
pacífica,
must be peaceful,
democrática
it must be
y
democratic,
liderada
and
por
led
los venezolanos
by the
con el
Venezuelans,
acompañamiento
with the
responsable de la
responsible
comunidad
assistance of
internacional,
the international
incluidas las
community,
Naciones Unidas
including
y los
the United
mecanismos
Nations
regionales
and
como la
regional
Organización
mechanisms
de
such as
Estados
the
Americanos.
Organization of American
Panamá
States.
no desea y quisiera
Panama
evitar
does not
que la
wish and would like
realidad
to
venezolana
avoid a scenario
pueda
in which
evolucionar
Venezuela's
simplemente
reality
en un
simply
cambio de
evolves
crisis
into a change
la
from
situación en que una crisis reemplace
one
a la otra.
crisis to another,
No
one
puede
crisis
hablarse de una
replacing
transición
another.
genuina
There can be
con
no
madurismo,
genuine
ni
transition
preservando las mismas
with
estructuras de poder
Madurismo
bajo nuevas
if it remains,
denominaciones.
or if we have
Cualquier
the same
arreglo
power
que
structures
mantenga en el
preserved under
centro
new
de la
names.
conducción
Any
a figuras asociadas al
arrangement that
aparato
keeps
represivo
figures associated with the
constituiría
repressive
en los
apparatus at the
hechos
center
una
of
continuidad
governance
del
would, in
sistema
practice,
y no una
constitute
transición
continuity of
real.
the system and not a
La
real
experiencia
transition.
comparada demuestra que
Comparative
las
experience
transiciones
shows
meramente
that
nominales
merely nominal
tienden a
transitions
prolongar los
tend
conflictos,
to prolong
acentuar
conflicts,
los flujos migratorios
intensify
y
migratory
perpetuar
flows,
la
and
inestabilidad
perpetuate
regional
regional
en detrimento de
instability
la paz
to the
y la
detriment
seguridad
of international
internacionales.
peace and security.
Panamá será siempre solidaria con un
Panama
proceso
will
de
always stand
transición
in solidarity
ordenado
with an
y
orderly
democrático,
and democratic transition
anclado en la
process,
voluntad popular
anchored
ya
in the
expresada en las
popular
urnas el
will
28 de
already
julio de
expressed at the polls
2024,
on July 28,
orientado al
2024,
restablecimiento
aimed
de la
at restoring
institucionalidad
democratic
democrática
institutions
mediante una interinidad
through an interim
estrictamente
period
limitada en el
strictly
tiempo,
limited in
cuyo
time,
único
the sole
propósito
purpose of
sea
which
crear las
is
condiciones
to create the
necesarias
conditions
para el ejercicio
necessary for the
efectivo de
effective
la libre
exercise
determinación
of the
del pueblo venezolano.
Venezuelan people's right to
Como país
self-determination.
que recuperó su
As a
democracia y
country
su
that recovered its
soberanía,
democracy and
Panamá
sovereignty,
afirma con
Panama
claridad
can state
que no
clearly
puede haber
that there
paz
can be
sin
no peace
legitimidad,
without
ni
legitimacy,
legitimidad sin
nor
democracia,
legitimacy without
y que toda
democracy,
democracia se
and that
sustenta
every
en
democracy
última
is
instancia
ultimately
en el
based
respeto
on
a la voluntad
respect for
popular.
the popular will.
Presidente,
Mr. President,
Panamá, desde
Panama,
su compromiso
due to our commitment to multilateralism and international law, in its capacity as member of the Security Council, will continue to contribute responsibly to collective efforts aimed at preserving peace, strengthening democracy, and supporting legitimate and sustainable solutions anchored in the sovereign will of peoples and respect for international law. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia on assuming the presidency of the United Nations Security Council in January, and wish you all success. Latvia takes its seat on the Council with a profound sense of honor and responsibility for this role. And let me thank Under-Secretary General Rosemarie DiCarlo for today's briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, and I thank the invited briefers. The Security Council bears primary responsibility for the global efforts to uphold peace, security, and rule of law worldwide. Latvia recalls that under all circumstances, the principles of international law and the UN Charter must be upheld. All efforts now focus on ensuring de-escalation and stability in Venezuela, based on inclusive dialogue and broad societal support. Latvia encourages all relevant actors to prioritize diplomatic efforts and work collectively towards a peaceful, democratic, and sustainable future for Venezuela. Latvia stands in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and their right to freedom and democracy. Rights that were not respected by the Maduro regime during 2024 presidential elections and before, and which remain unmet to this day. The regime of Nicolas Maduro was rooted in mass repression, corruption, organized crime, including drug trafficking, and posed a grave threat to security of the region and the world. It has repeatedly violated the UN Charter and undermined international law, including through open support for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The Maduro regime does not represent the will of the Venezuelan people and has relied on widespread, systematic repressions of human rights across the country to maintain power. 8 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee the country since 2014. Latvia also remains committed to working jointly together with partners to counter global transnational organized crime networks, including in Latin America and Caribbean. Such criminal activities place the lives of countless people at grave risk, particularly women and children. Addressing these challenges requires sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Latvia continues to closely monitor the situation in Venezuela and stands prepared to continue working with its partners to support a peaceful, democratic, and just transition that reflects the aspirations of the Venezuelan people. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General. We also listened carefully to the briefing by Ms. de Freitas and Mr. Sachs. Mr. President, Denmark joins the Secretary General in expressing deep concern over the evolving situation in Venezuela. Since this council met to discuss the situation 2 weeks ago, we have seen a drastic escalation, culminating in a large-scale military operation on January 3rd. At our last meeting, Denmark urged all actors to strictly adhere to international law and to de-escalate tensions and exercise the necessary restraint. Today, we echo the Secretary General in his concern regarding the worrying implications of this military action. Independent of the situation in Venezuela, these developments constitute a dangerous precedent. International law and the UN Charter, as a pillar of the international security architecture, must be respected by all states. Denmark recalls the foundational principle of international law that forbids states from threatening or using force against another state's territorial integrity and political independence. This imperative is enshrined
in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. Members of the UN Security Council have a special responsibility to uphold these principles. The principles of sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity must be respected. The inviolability of borders is not up for negotiation. These are universal, sacrosanct principles enshrined in international law. They apply everywhere. Mr. President, once again, Denmark calls on all parties to urgently de-escalate tensions that could threaten peace and stability in the region and beyond. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, as stated in the UN Charter. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to engage in dialogue and diplomacy. Denmark takes note of official statements from the United States government stating that the military operations are to combat drug trafficking and stem the illicit flow of illegal narcotics. Denmark shares the priority of combating organized crime and drug trafficking, while reiterating that counter-narcotic efforts, as all other efforts, must be conducted in strict accordance with international law, including the fundamental rules and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, against this backdrop, Denmark wishes to recall our solidarity with the people of Venezuela. Denmark does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, following the lack of transparency and integrity in the 2024 presidential elections, which failed to meet basic democratic standards. In Maduro's attempts to cling to power, his authoritarian regime grew increasingly oppressive. His regime bears responsibility for widespread and systematic violations of human rights against his fellow citizens, and he should be held accountable. The victims of the Maduro regime's alleged crimes against humanity have to be heard. The Venezuelan people have a right to democracy and self-determination exercised through peaceful, inclusive, and credible democratic processes, free from fear of political persecution, intimidation, or repression, and external political interference. This includes the rights of Venezuelans alone to determine their political, economic, and social future without coercion, pressure, or manipulation by external actors. No state should seek to influence political outcomes in Venezuela through the use of threat of force or through other means inconsistent with international law. Venezuela's future can be decided only by the Venezuelans. We call on all parties and stakeholders to come together for a negotiated and peaceful transition to democratic rule in a process led by and owned by Venezuelans. At this critical and uncertain time, it is imperative that all parties fully respect human rights and international law. Denmark remains committed to supporting Venezuela and the aspirations of its people on its path to lasting political stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I congratulate Somalia on the assumption of the presidency of the Council for the month of January. And I thank our briefers for their remarks. Colleagues, the Venezuelan people have suffered for years. This Council now meets at a pivotal moment for Venezuela's future. Maduro's actions created extreme levels of poverty, violent repression, and failing basic services. His regime's rule precipitated a displacement crisis affecting the whole region. The United Kingdom has long been clear that Maduro's claim to power was fraudulent. To date, Venezuela's National Electoral Council has failed to publish the full results of the July 2024 presidential elections, and independent domestic and international reports also observed significant irregularities and a lack of transparency. President, The United Kingdom wants to see a safe and peaceful transition to a legitimate government that reflects the will of the Venezuelan people. They deserve a government which reflects their vote at the ballot box and delivers a more stable, prosperous future for all Venezuelans. Finally, President, the United Kingdom reaffirms its commitment to international law and the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These foundations are essential for maintaining global peace, security, and the rule of law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je voudrais d'abord vous féliciter pour votre présidence du Conseil de sécurité au mois de janvier. Je voudrais également remercier Madame Rosemary DiCarlo de nous avoir transmis les éléments du secrétaire général des Nations Unies au sujet du dernier développement intervenu au Venezuela. Monsieur le Président, la France est restée solidaire du peuple vénézuélien dans la crise qu'il traverse depuis de trop nombreuses années, et en particulier depuis l'été 2024. Le 28 juillet 2024, le peuple vénézuélien a exercé son droit de vote de façon pacifique pour déterminer l'avenir de son pays. Son droit à choisir ses dirigeants lui a néanmoins été confisqué
has been
Nicolas
stripped
Maduro.
away from the people by Nicolas
Faut-il le
Maduro.
rappeler?
Must you recall the
Le
facts?
processus
The
électoral
electoral
avait été
process
marqué
has been
par de
marred,
nombreuses
was
irrégularités
marred by numerous
et le décompte final des
irregularities,
voix
and the final
par une
counting of
absence
votes was
flagrante
marred by
de
a
transparence.
flagrant lack of transparency.
Face à l'aspiration
In
démocratique du
light of
peuple
the democratic
vénézuélien,
aspirations
Nicolas
of the
Maduro
Venezuelan
a
people,
systématiquement
Nicolas
répondu par
Maduro
la
has
répression des
systematically
voix
responded
dissidentes,
with the
des membres de
repression
l'opposition
of dissident
et de la
voices
société civile,
of members of the
ainsi
opposition
que
and
par
of
de
civil society,
multiples
as well as with
détentions arbitraires.
numerous arbitrary
La France
detentions.
s'est toujours
France
exprimée
has
avec clarté
always expressed
fait
itself
que
with
ces
clarity about the
étaient
fact that
inacceptables
these
et que le
practices are
respect des droits de l'homme
unacceptable and that
devait
respect
être
for human
garanti.
rights must be upheld.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
l'opération
the
militaire qui
military
a conduit
operation
à la
which has
capture
led
de
to
Nicolas
the
Maduro
capture of Nicolas
contrevient
Maduro
au
runs
principe
counter
de
to the
règlement
principle
pacifique des
of
différends
peaceful dispute
et à
resolution
celui
and
de non-recours à la
runs
force.
counter to the principle of non-use of
La
force.
multiplication
The
des violations de
proliferation
la
of
Charte des
violations of the
Nations
Charter
Unies
of the United
et du
Nations
droit
and the
international
violations of
par des États
international law
investis de la
by states
responsabilité de
vested
membres
with
permanents de ce
responsibility
Conseil
as permanent members of the Security
sape les
Council
bases
chips
de
away at the
l'ordre
very
international.
foundation of the international order,
Contrevenir aux principes de la Charte,
contravening the principles
parmi
of the
lesquels les
Charter,
principes de
including
respect
the
de
principle of respect
l'indépendance
for
et de
independence
l'intégrité
and the
territoriale des
territorial
États,
integrity of states,
mine les fondements des Nations Unies
undermines the
et
foundation of the United
fragilise la paix
Nations and
et la sécurité
weakens
internationale.
international peace and security.
La France
France
fidèle
remains
et engagée
faithful
pour le
and
respect de
committed
la
to
Charte des
respect
Nations
for the
Unies
Charter
et
of the
du
United
principe
Nations
de
and of
règlement
the
pacifique des
principle of
différends.
peaceful dispute
Nous
resolution.
devons mettre en œuvre ces
We
principes
have an obligation to uphold
en
these
tout temps
principles at all
et en
times
tout lieu.
and in all places.
Le respect
Respect for
est
these
indispensable.
principles is indispensable.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
la France
France
réitère son attachement
wishes
au
to
respect de
reiterate
la
our commitment
volonté
to respect for
du
the
peuple
for the
vénézuélien.
will of the Venezuelan
La
people.
transition qui s'ouvre à
The
présent pour le
transition which is
Venezuela doit être
currently
pacifique,
being opened up for
démocratique
Venezuela needs to be
et
peaceful
respectueuse des
and
choix du
democratic
peuple
and
vénézuélien, qui est un peuple
carried out in a
souverain.
manner which respects the choice of the Venezuelan people,
Cette
a sovereign
transition doit
people.
être
This
dirigée
transition
par
must be
et
led
pour
by
les Vénézuéliens.
and for the
La France se
Venezuelans.
tient prête avec les États
France
de la
stands
région et ses
ready,
partenaires de l'Union
alongside
européenne,
states in the region
à
and
soutenir
our
le dialogue
partners at the
en
European
vue de la
Union to
restauration de la
uphold
libre
dialogue
expression
with a view to the
démocratique au
restoration of the
Venezuela
free
et à
democratic
appuyer la
expression in
stabilité
Venezuela.
régionale.
We stand ready to support regional
Ce doit être
stability.
aussi
This
le rôle
also
de ce
needs to
Conseil.
be the
Je
role
vous
of the
remercie.
Security Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Mr. President, I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate first and foremost the Federal Republic of Somalia on its presidency of the Security Council during this month of January. We wish you every success.
أود أن أعرب عن الشكر إلى وفود الجزائر
We also wish to
وغيانا
take this opportunity
وجمهورية
to
كوريا
thank delegations
وسيراليون
whose mandate at the
وسلوفينيا
Council ended, namely
التي انتهت
Algeria,
فترة
Guyana,
عضويتها في المجلس
the
على
Republic of Korea,
إسهاماتها
Sierra
المهمة
Leone,
في
as well as
تحقيق
Slovenia.
غايات
We wish to
ورسالة
thank them
المجلس.
for their significant contributions to
كما
the
أتقدم
attainment of the
بالشكر
goals
للسيدة روزماري
and the
دي
mission
كارلو
of the Council. I
وكيلة
also wish
الأمين
to
العام
thank Madam
للشؤون
Rosemary DiCarlo,
السياسية وبناء
Undersecretary
السلام
General
على
for Political and
الإحاطة
Peace-Building
القيمة
Affairs,
وجميع مقدمي
for
الإحاطات
her valuable
بشأن
briefing
التطورات
related
الأخيرة
to
في
the
جمهورية
latest
فنزويلا
developments which have taken
البوليفارية
place at in the Bolivarian
وأقدر
Republic of
تأكيد
Venezuela, and I
معالي
wish to
الأمين
thank other
العام للأمم
briefers as
المتحدة
well. We
على
appreciate
التمسك
the
بالمبادئ
reaffirmation by
الأساسية
His Excellency the
لميثاق
Secretary
الأمم
General of the United
المتحدة
Nations, reaffirmation of the commitment
وأهمية
to the
حل النزاعات
fundamental principles of the
الدبلوماسية
Charter of the United Nations, a commitment to
وتؤيد
the
مملكة البحرين
peaceful diplomatic
دعوة معالي
resolution of
الأمين
disputes. The
العام
Kingdom of
لجميع
Bahrain
الأطراف الفاعلة في
supports the
فنزويلا
call of the Secretary General
إلى
for
الانخراط في
all
حوار شامل
stakeholders in Venezuela
بما يضمن
to engage in
الالتزام
inclusive
بالقانون الدولي
dialogue which
لتخفيف
guarantees
عدة
respect for
التوترات
international law, and
والحفاظ على
this in order
الاستقرار
to
الإقليمي
ease tensions,
وتجنيب
to
المنطقة
preserve
أي
regional stability,
تداعيات
and to avoid
سلبية
any
تؤثر على أمنها
potential adverse
واستقرارها.
repercussions for security and stability in the region.
كما تعرب مملكة البحرين
The Kingdom
عن
of Bahrain
دعمها للجهود الإقليمية
also
والدولية الرامية
extends its support for
إلى
efforts
خفض
undertaken at
التوتر
the regional and international
وتعزيز
levels in
المسارات
order to
الدبلوماسية
reduce tensions
بما
and to
يحقق الأمن
enhance diplomatic
والسلم
means
الدوليين
in order to provide for
وتؤكد على
international
أهمية
peace and
تعزيز
security.
التعاون الدولي
The Kingdom stresses the importance of the
لدعم جميع
promotion
الجهود
of international
الإقليمية
cooperation
والدولية
in order to
لمكافحة
support
انتشار
all
الجريمة
regional and
المنظمة
international efforts
والمخدرات
which are geared
وما
towards combating
يترتب عليها من
international
تفشي
organized
الآفات
crime,
التي تهدد
trafficking in
استقرار
drugs, as
المجتمعات
well as scourges which are related
وتعيق
to
تحقيق
this.
التنمية
This
المستدامة
undermines the stability of
وضمان
societies,
معالجة هذه
undermines
الآفات
achievement of sustainable
وفقا
development.
للاتفاقيات
Therefore,
الدولية
these
لا
issues
تقبل.
need to be dealt with in accordance with
وختاما
international
تجدد
relevant
مملكة البحرين
conventions. By
دعمها
way of
للجهود
conclusion, the Kingdom
الإقليمية
of
والدولية
Bahrain
الهادفة
reaffirms our support for
لتحقيق
regional and international
حل سياسي
efforts
ومستدام في
to
جمهورية
achieve
فنزويلا
a
البوليفارية
political,
في إطار
lasting
تعاون
solution in the
إقليمي
Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
واحترام السيادة
This needs to be
الوطنية
achieved through
بما
regional
يحقق
cooperation
الأمن
and with
والاستقرار في
respect for national
فنزويلا
sovereignty. The goal is
وتجنيبها
to
مخاطر
provide for
النزاع
security and
والانقسام
stability in Venezuela,
وحماية
to
السلم
avoid
الأهلي
risks of conflict and
وبما
division,
يسهم
to
في
protect
الحفاظ على
civil
أمن
peace, and
المنطقة
to contribute to the
واستقرارها
preservation
وصون
of
السلم
regional
والأمن
security and
الدوليين
stability, as
وشكرا
well
سيد
as
الرئيس.
international peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to begin by congratulating Somalia on its assumption of the presidency for this month and assuring you of my delegation's full support and cooperation. We welcome the new members joining the Council. I thank Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for reading out the remarks of the Secretary General and the valuable briefing. We also take note of the views shared by Mr. Jeffrey Sachs and Ms. Mercedes de Freitas. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Venezuela alongside the representatives of other countries from the region and beyond in the meeting. Mr. President, Pakistan views the recent developments in Venezuela with profound concern. In a world already beset by multiple crises, escalating tensions and instability in the Caribbean do not augur well for regional and international peace and security. The UN Charter enjoins us to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. The UN Charter also binds member states to sovereign equality, non-interference in the internal affairs of others, and settlement of international disputes by peaceful means. Unilateral military action contravenes these sacrosanct principles and the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Such actions set dangerous precedents that risk eroding the foundations of the global legal framework. They also fuel instability, which, as history has shown time and again, can lead to unpredictable and uncontrollable outcomes for years to come. Mr. President, at this critical juncture, the path forward must be one of dialogue and diplomacy. Durable solutions to political differences can only be found through peaceful means, with full respect for the will of the Venezuelan people, free from any external interference. We hope that Latin American and the Caribbean region, as a zone of peace, will remain free from conflict and confrontation and continue its march towards enhanced regional cooperation and improved prosperity for the people. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, de-escalate tensions, pursue peaceful coexistence, refrain from any actions that could exacerbate the volatile situation, and engage in dialogue, including by utilizing the sincere offers of mediation. The good offices of the Secretary General also always remain available for that purpose. Lastly, Mr. President, I affirm Pakistan's commitment to contributing constructively to the discharge of the Security Council's primary responsibility for addressing the threat to international peace and security by diffusing tensions, promoting pacific settlement, and upholding respect for international law and the UN Charter. Peace and stability of Venezuela and the welfare and prosperity of its people, with full ownership, must be the overriding objective of all efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Somalia for assuming the presidency of the Council for the month of January, and I would like to welcome the newly elected members joining the Council. I would also like to thank USG Di Carlo for her briefing on behalf of the Secretary General, as well as Mr. Sachs and Ms. De Freitas for their remarks. Mr. President, Greece is closely monitoring developments in Venezuela. We urge all actors to exercise maximum restraint and to refrain from actions that would deepen the crisis and undermine prospects for peace and stability. Greece reiterates that the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including human rights law, must always be respected. We also recall the obligation of all parties to protect civilians, especially in times of heightened tensions. Greece shares the priority of combating transnational organized crime and drug trafficking, which pose a significant security threat worldwide. We reiterate that these challenges should be addressed through sustained cooperation in full respect of international law. Mr. President, Greece firmly believes that dialogue and diplomacy are the only viable tools for a peaceful transition and a sustainable resolution of the crisis. We join the Secretary General in encouraging all actors in Venezuela to engage in inclusive and meaningful dialogue in full respect of human rights, democratic principles, and the rule of law. We have long been clear that Nicolas Maduro's and illegitimate president's claim to power lacks legitimacy. Greece has not recognized the results of the rigged elections of July 28, 2024, and has always supported initiatives aimed at achieving a democratic solution for Venezuela. We stand firmly with the people of Venezuela in their pursuit of a democratic future, and we express the hope that the recent events will lead to this effect. The voices of all Venezuelans need to be heard, and they deserve governance that reflects their will through peaceful and inclusive processes. In this spirit, we will continue to support efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful, negotiated transition that ensures the will of all Venezuelans is fully respected. Greece stands ready to support all regional and international efforts aimed at the peaceful resolution of the crisis in line with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for this statement and now give the floor to the representative of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Antes de abordar el fondo de
Before
nuestra
coming
intervención,
to the substance of our
consideramos
statement
necesario
today,
realizar una precisión de
I think
carácter
we need
institucional.
to make an
Observamos
institutional
con
clarification.
preocupación que se
We
intente
note with
presentar
concern
ante este Consejo de
that
Seguridad
an attempt is being
como
made
una supuesta
to
representante de
present
la
to
sociedad
the
civil
Security
a
Council
una persona cuya
a
trayectoria
supposed
pública ha estado
representative
marcada
of
por el
civil society,
financiamiento
a
sostenido
person whose
de
public career
gobiernos extranjeros y
trajectory bears the
corporaciones
hallmarks
transnacionales.
of sustained funding
Están
from foreign
las pruebas para
governments
quien quiera hablar.
and transnational
Por años,
corporations. This has been the case for years, as well as participation in processes of political destabilization and the promotion of institutional breakdown in her own country. The instrumental use of this person to legitimize narratives of confrontation, justify the use of force, or minimize violations of international law does not contribute in any way to the purposes of this Council or to the strengthening of multilateralism. On the contrary, it erodes the credibility of the debates and distorts the Security Council's mandate entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Mr. President, on January 3rd, 2026 is a date of profound historical significance, not only for Venezuela, but for the international system as a whole. On that day, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela was the target of an illegitimate armed attack, lacking any legal justification by the government of the United States of America, which included bombing of our territory, the loss of civilian and military lives, the destruction of civilian infrastructure, essential infrastructure, and the kidnapping of the constitutional president of the Republic, Nicolas Maduro Morris, and the First Lady Celia Flores. Venezuela comes before this Council today with a deep conviction that international peace can only be sustained if international law is respected without exception, without double standards, and without selective interpretations. The events of January 3rd constitute a flagrant violation of the UN Charter perpetrated by the US government, in particular, the violation of the principle of sovereign equality of states, of the absolute prohibition of the use or threat of use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, as enshrined in Article 2, Paragraph 4. And a violation of the duty to settle disputes by peaceful means. Similarly, these acts also seriously violate the Geneva Conventions and its protocols, as indiscriminate attacks were carried out against the civilian population and assets. International human rights law has also been violated, particularly the right to life, personal integrity, and security. Of particular seriousness is the kidnapping of the President of the Republic by the government of the United States of America, which constitutes a direct violation of an essential norm of the international legal order, namely the personal immunity of heads of state in office. This immunity is not an individual privilege. It is an institutional guarantee that protects the sovereignty of states and the stability of the international system. Its disregard not only affects Venezuela, but also sets an extremely dangerous precedent for all states represented in this chamber, regardless of their size, power, or alliances. Mr. President, General Assembly Resolution 3314 clearly defines as an act of aggression the bombing of the territory of one state by the armed forces of another state, as well as the invasion or occupation, even without formal annexation. The events we are denouncing here unequivocally fit this definition. In 2004, the International Court of Justice affirmed that occupation exists when a state exercises effective control, even without formal annexation or the continuous presence of troops. Security Council Resolution 242, for its part, emphasizes that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, while General Assembly Resolution 2625 establishes that the territory of a state shall not be subject to military occupation as a result of the use of force in contravention of the UN Charter. Allowing such acts to go without an effective answer would amount to normalizing the replacement of law by might, while eroding the very foundations of the collective security system. Today, it is not only Venezuela's sovereignty that is at stake, the credibility of international law, the authority of this organization, and the validity of the principle that no state can set itself up as the judge, party, and executor of the world order are also at stake. Mr. President, we cannot ignore a central element of this U.S. aggression. Venezuela is the victim of these attacks because of its natural resources. Our country's oil, energy, strategic resources, and geopolitical position have historically been factors of greed and external pressure. When force is used to control resources, impose governments, or redesign states, we are faced with a logic that harks back to the worst practices of colonialism and neocolonialism. Accepting such a logic would mean to open the door to a deeply unstable world in which countries with greater military capacities can decide by force the political and economic destinies of other states. This scenario not only threatens Venezuela, it threatens international peace and security as a whole. If the kidnapping of a head of state, the bombing of a sovereign country, and the open threat of further armed action are tolerated or downplayed, the message sent to the world is a devastating one, namely that the law is optional and that force is the true arbiter of international relations. Venezuela firmly believes in diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful coexistence among nations. That has always been our historical position, and it remains so today, even in the face of an aggression of this magnitude. It is precisely that commitment to peace, the one that was violated on the 3rd of January. Therefore, Venezuela urges the Security Council to fully assume its responsibility and to act in accordance with the mandate conferred upon it by the Charter of the United Nations. In that regard, we request, A, that the government of the United States of America be demanded to fully respect the immunities of President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, as well as their immediate release and safe return to Venezuela. 2, that the use of force against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela be clearly and unequivocally condemned. Thirdly, that the principle of non-acquisition of territory or resources by force be reaffirmed. And 4, that measures aimed at de-escalation, the protection of the civilian population, and the restoration of international law be adopted. Mr. President, in spite of the seriousness of the events, Venezuela would like to inform this body and the international community that its institutions are functioning normally, that constitutional order has been preserved, and that the state exercises effective control over all of its territory. In accordance with our constitution, Executive Vice President Delcy Rodriguez is being sworn in as acting President of the Republic, thereby guaranteeing institutional continuity, stability, and internal peace. We wish to convey a message of serenity, confidence, and hope to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela is a nation that believes in peace, work, and dignity. Our commitment is to diplomacy and law, and the law is firm and unwavering. We defend our sovereignty without renouncing our values. We bet on dialogue without accepting imposition. We believe in a future of coexistence, development, and mutual respect among nations. We trust that the Security Council will rise to the historic moment facing humanity and choose the path of legality, collective responsibility, and peace. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Buenos días y muchas gracias,
good morning,
señor presidente.
and thank you very much, Mr. President.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
el gobierno de la República
the
Argentina
government of the
valora
Argentine
la
Republic
decisión y la
values the
determinación
decision
demostrada por
and
el presidente de
determination
Estados Unidos
demonstrated by the President
su
of the
gobierno
United States
en
of
las
America
recientes
and by
acciones
his government
adoptadas en
in the
Venezuela,
recent actions
que
taken in
derivaron en la
Venezuela
captura del
that
dictador
resulted in the
Nicolás Maduro,
capture of the
líder
dictator
del
Nicolas
cartel de los
Maduro,
Soles,
leader of the
declarada como
Cartel of the
organización
Suns,
terrorista por el gobierno argentino en
declared a
2025,
terrorist organization
mismo año
by
en el que la
Argentina
República
in
Argentina declaró
2025,
también
the same year in which Argentina also declared the Nicaragua a terrorist organization. The Argentine Republic trusts that these events represent a decisive step forward against narco-terrorism that affects the region, and at the same time open a stage that will allow the Venezuelan people to fully recover democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights in accordance with the principles of international law, and put an end to the oppression exercised for years by the authoritarian regime that plunged the Venezuelan people into poverty and forced 8 million Venezuelans to have to flee their country. Mr. President, the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro has not only constituted a direct threat to Venezuelan citizens through the systematic violation of human rights, the appropriation of the country's resources, and the destruction of democratic institutions, but also to the entire region by leading and exporting its networks of drug trafficking and organized crime. Since the inauguration of President Javier Milei, Argentina has been clear and consistent in its position regarding this situation. We have unequivocally denounced the lack of freedoms and the serious human rights violations, and we have actively contributed with determination and responsibility to international efforts aimed at the return of democracy in Venezuela. In March 2024, when others opted for inaction or ambiguity, Argentina granted diplomatic asylum to 6 Venezuelan opposition leaders, assuming an enormous challenge for our representation in Caracas. Subsequently, after denouncing the fraudulent nature of the result announced in the 28 July 2024 elections and recognizing Edmundo González Urrutia as president-elect, Argentina was expelled from Venezuela. Our embassy, where the asylum seekers remained, was subject to a permanent siege. Despite these pressures, the Argentine Republic maintained its unwavering conviction to continue denouncing the situation in Venezuela and to act in every available international forum so that Venezuela could once again embrace freedom and democracy. Mr. President, this is not the first time that Argentina has addressed the Security Council regarding the situation in Venezuela. On the 23rd of December last, we expressed our deep concern over institutional and humanitarian deteriorating situation, noting the effects of the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro transcended the domestic sphere and negatively affected regional stability, constituting a concrete threat to hemispheric security. In the same vein, President Milei stated at the Mercosur summit that Argentina welcomed the pressure from the United States aimed at freeing the Venezuelan people. Today, the international community faces a new scenario that poses a dual challenge: to support a genuine democratic transition in Venezuela and to contribute to the lasting restoration of peace and security in our region. Faced with both challenges, the Argentine Republic stands ready and willing to cooperate. We reaffirm our firm commitment to the full restoration of institutional normalcy and the rule of law in Venezuela, always safeguarding the freedom, human dignity, and prosperity of the brotherly Venezuelan people, as well as our determination to continue fighting against the scourge of narco-terrorism and those who contribute to its financing. The process that begins today requires the firm and coordinated commitment of all those countries that have accompanied the Venezuelan people in their long struggle, so that Venezuela can leave behind more than 2 decades of political, humanitarian, and social crisis, and can finally be reunited with freedom, democracy, respect for human rights, and economic prosperity. Mr. President, finally, the Argentine Republic requests that the authorities responsible for administering the transition in Venezuela contribute to the immediate release of the Argentine citizen Nahuel Gallo, who has been in a situation of enforced disappearance since the 8th of December 2024, in clear violation of his human rights, and that his prompt and safe return to our country be guaranteed. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Argentina and now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr.
Chile agradece a
President.
Somalia por
Chile
la
would like to
convocatoria de
thank
esta
Somalia
sesión
for convening
informativa
this
abierta bajo el punto del orden
informational
del
briefing
día, amenazas a
under
la paz y la
the
seguridad
item threats to
internacional.
international peace and
Agradecemos
security.
asimismo la
We'd
intervención de la
also
señora
like
Rosemary
to
de
thank
Carlos, secretaria
Madam
general
Rosemary
adjunta
DiCarlo,
de Asuntos Políticos y
USG
de
for
Consolidación de
Political
la
and
Paz,
Peacebuilding
así
Affairs,
como las
as
presentaciones
well
del
as
profesor
the
Jeffrey
briefings
Sachs
from
y de la
Mr.
señora
Jeffrey Sachs
Mercedes de
and
Freitas.
Ms. Mercedes de
Señor
Freitas.
presidente, Chile desea expresar su
President,
profunda
Chile would like to
preocupación
express our
y
deep
firme
concern
condena
and
por
firm
las acciones
condemnation
militares
of the
unilaterales de los Estados
unilateral
Unidos
military
sobre el
action taken
territorio de
by
la
the United
República
States in the
Bolivariana de
territory
Venezuela.
of the Bolivarian Republic of
Asimismo,
Venezuela.
reiteramos
We also
consistentemente
reiterate
nuestro firme
consistently our
compromiso con el
firm
respeto al derecho
commitment to
internacional,
respect for
la
international
soberanía y la
law,
integridad
sovereignty
territorial,
and
la
territorial
solución
integrity of
pacífica de las
states and the peaceful
controversias,
settlement
la
of
prohibición de
disputes,
la
the
amenaza o el uso de
prohibition
la
of the
fuerza
threat
y
or
el
the
pleno
use of the
respeto de
threat
los
of
derechos
force and
humanos.
full respect for human
Estas
rights.
afirmaciones son
These
aceptadas por la mayoría de
affirmations
los
are
discursos
accepted by
y aunque repetidas, no pueden
the
perder su
majority,
profundo valor
and they
para garantizar la paz y la seguridad
must maintain
internacional.
their importance in order to
Ya
preserve
lo
international
dijimos en
peace and
nuestra
security.
intervención del
We
23
said
de
this on the
diciembre
23rd
y
of
lo
December when we
reiteramos
took the
hoy.
floor, and we
Chile
reiterate
no
this today.
reconoce
Chile
el
does not
régimen de Maduro,
recognize the Maduro
pero las graves
regime,
violaciones a los
but
derechos humanos que
serious
enfrenta
violations
Venezuela
of human
no
rights being
tienen una
faced by
solución
Venezuela
militar
do not have a
y solo
military
pueden
solution.
abordarse
They can
mediante
only
procesos
be addressed
pacíficos,
through
graduales
peaceful,
e
gradual,
inclusivos
and
que
inclusive
consideren las
measures that
legítimas
will
aspiraciones
take
del
into account
pueblo
the
venezolano.
legitimate aspirations of the
El
Venezuelan
respeto del
people.
derecho
Respect
internacional
for
no
international
admite
law
excepciones,
does not allow for
incluso cuando se
exceptions,
trata de
including
abordar la
when it comes
ilegitimidad
to
de un
addressing the
presidente.
illegitimacy
Los
of
problemas
a
deben
president.
resolverse
Problems
siempre
must
dentro
always
del
be
marco
solved
normativo
within
que
the
como
normative
naciones nos
framework
hemos dado.
that we have
El
provided
futuro
for
de
ourselves
Venezuela
as
debe
nations. The
construirse
future of
con elecciones
Venezuela
libres,
must include
participación
free
ciudadana
elections,
y
citizen
acompañamiento
participation,
internacional,
and
y no
international
con acciones que
assistance, and
puedan
not with
abrir
actions
precedentes
that could
peligrosos
create
o escalar
dangerous
tensiones
precedents or
en la región
escalate
con
tensions
consecuencias
in the
graves
region with
para la
serious
población.
consequences for the population.
Chile, como testigo
Chile,
de la historia,
as a witness
desde su
of
propia
history and
experiencia en la
based
pérdida
on
de la
our
democracia,
own experience with
donde
the loss of
existió
democracy,
injerencia
where there
extranjera
was foreign
que
interference
causó profundo
that
daño y dolor en el
caused
pueblo
extreme
chileno,
damage and pain for
logró
the Chilean
recuperar
people.
la
We were
democracia
able to
en un
recover our
proceso de
democracy
transición
through a
llevado
transitional
adelante con
process
apoyo de
that
la
was carried
comunidad
out with the
internacional,
assistance of the
la
international
fuerza de la
community,
ciudadanía organizada
the
y
strength
la
of
vía
organized
institucional.
citizens, and through our
Señor
institutions.
presidente, Chile
Mr.
desea
President,
subrayar
Chile
además
would like
la
also to
necesidad
underscore
urgente
the
de
urgent
continuar
need
realizando
to
esfuerzos
continue
coordinados
with
en el marco
coordinated
multilateral
efforts
para enfrentar la
multilaterally
amenaza del
to
crimen organizado
address
transnacional, así
transnational
como la
organized
convicción
crime.
de que
And
América
we're also
Latina y el
convinced that
Caribe
Latin America
deben
and the
seguir siendo una
Caribbean
zona
must
de paz,
continue to be
porque
a
esa zona
zone
de
of
paz
peace, because
no
that
solo le
zone of
sirve a
peace
América
not
Latina,
only serves
sino
Latin
al
America
mundo
and the
entero.
Caribbean, but the entire
Un
world.
conflicto armado
An
tendría
armed
consecuencias
conflict will
humanitarias
have
devastadoras en
devastating
Venezuela y en la
humanitarian
región,
consequences in Venezuela
profundizaría
and
el
in the
sufrimiento de
region.
la
It will
población
worsen the
civil
suffering of the
y
civilian
agravaría aún
population
más las
and worsen
dinámicas de
even
desplazamiento,
further the
inseguridad y
displacement,
vulnerabilidad.
insecurity, and vulnerability
Reiteramos,
aspects of the
cualquier
situation.
diferencia
We
debe abordarse
reiterate that
exclusivamente
any
a través de
differences
medios
must be dealt
pacíficos,
with
en estricto
exclusively
respeto del
through
derecho
peaceful means,
internacional,
in strict
la
respect for
soberanía de los
international law,
estados
the
y
sovereignty
la
of states,
prohibición
and
del
the
uso o la
prohibition of
amenaza
the
del
use or
uso
the
de la
threat of the
fuerza.
use of force.
Como fue recientemente
As
señalado
was
por los
recently
jefes de Estado de
indicated by
Brasil,
the
Chile,
heads of
Colombia,
state of
México,
Brazil, Chile,
Uruguay y España,
Mexico, Uruguay, and
manifestamos
Spain,
nuestra preocupación
we
ante
express
cualquier
our
intento
concern with
de
regard to
control
any
gubernamental,
attempt to
de administración o
control
apropiación
government
externa
administration or
de
foreign
recursos naturales y estratégicos,
ownership
lo
of
que resulte incompatible con el
strategic
derecho
assets.
internacional
This would be
y
against
amenaza
international law and would threaten the political, economic, and social stability of the region.
Señor presidente,
Mr.
frente a
President,
este escenario complejo,
given this
Chile
complex
considera valioso
scenario,
el papel que pueden
Chile
desempeñar los mecanismos
welcomes
multilaterales
the
de
role
diálogo
that
y
could be
prevención.
played
En
by
ese
multilateral
espíritu, vemos con especial
fora.
atención
And
el
here,
rol de Naciones
particularly,
Unidas,
we would
en
refer to the
particular
role of the
el
United
papel que
Nations,
puede
and
jugar
particularly the
el
role that could be
secretario
played by
general
the
y
Secretary
este
General
Consejo,
and by this
con el
Council,
consentimiento de las partes
with the
pertinentes
consent of
para
the
contribuir
parties
a la
involved
reducción
to
de
contribute
tensiones
to
y a la búsqueda de
de-escalating the
entendimientos
situation
que
and searching
favorezcan
for
una
an
salida
understanding
pacífica
that would
y
favor a
sostenible.
peaceful and lasting
El
exit
liderazgo
to the
prudente
crisis.
y la experiencia acumulada
Prudent
por nuestra
leadership
organización,
and experience
así
of
como
our
los mecanismos
organization, as well
regionales,
as the
pueden ser un
regional
apoyo relevante para
organizations and
evitar
mechanisms, can
un
be very
mayor
relevant
deterioro
to
de la
avoid a
situación
further
y
worsening
para
of
mantener
the
abiertos los
situation and to
canales de
keep open
comunicación.
the
Señor presidente,
channels
Chile
of
reitera su
communication. Chile
disposición
reiterates
a
its
respaldar iniciativas
preparedness to
constructivas
support
que
constructive
apunten en esa
initiatives
dirección
that
y a
will
trabajar
point in this
junto a los
direction and
países de la
work together
región
with
y a la
countries of
comunidad
the region and with the
internacional
international
en favor de la
community
estabilidad
for stability and mutual understanding and respect for the principles that underpin this organization. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Chile for the statement and now give the floor to the representatives of Brazil.
Mr. President,
we'd like to thank Somalia for convening this emergency session of the Security Council. Brazil categorically and firmly rejects the armed intervention in Venezuelan territory in flagrant violation of the Charter of the United Nations and of international law. The bombings on Venezuelan territory and the capture of its president cross an unacceptable line. These acts constitute a very serious affront to the sovereignty of Venezuela and set an extremely dangerous precedent for the entire international community. The Charter of the United Nations establishes as a pillar of the international order the prohibition of the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, except in the circumstances strictly provided for therein. The acceptance of actions of this nature would inexorably lead to a scenario marked by violence, disorder, and the erosion of multilateralism to the detriment of international law and institutions. The effects of the weakening of international governance and cooperation mechanisms are already evident. The record number since the Second World War of 61 active armed conflicts, the unprecedented figure of 117 million people in situations of humanitarian disaster around the world, reflecting the increase in wars, displacement, and crimes against humanity, such as the genocide in Gaza, and the global increase in military spending, which is approaching the historical mark of $2.7 trillion. As Brazil has reiterated on numerous occasions, the norms that govern coexistence among states are mandatory and universal. They do not admit exceptions based on ideological, geopolitical, political, economic, or any other kind of interests or projects. They do not admit that the exploitation of natural or economic resources justifies the use of force or the illegal change of a government. The multipolar world of the 21st century, which promotes peace and prosperity, must not be confused with spheres of influence. We cannot accept the argument that the end justifies the means. This reasoning lacks legitimacy and opens the possibility of granting the strongest the right to define what is just or unjust, what is right or wrong, and even to ignore national sovereignties, imposing the decisions to be taken by the weakest. Latin America and the Caribbean have made peace a conscious, lasting, and irreversible choice. The resort to force in our region evokes chapters of history that we believed we'd left behind us and endangers the collective effort to preserve the region as a zone of peace and cooperation, free of armed conflicts, respectful of international law and the principle of non-intervention. Armed interventions in the past have had profoundly negative and lasting consequences. Contrary to freedom and democracy, those interventions produced authoritarian regimes and serious violations of human rights, leaving as a lamentable result thousands of dead, political prisoners, tortured persons, and disappeared persons whose families still today search for their loved ones, as well as justice and reparation. For the first time in South America, a profoundly alarming event has occurred. An external armed aggression with the deployment of troops and bombings in a neighboring country contiguous with Brazil, with which we share more than 2,000 kilometers of border. Mr. President, South America is a zone of peace. I insist upon that. We have upheld and will uphold with full determination peace and non-intervention in our region. Furthermore, Brazil does not believe that the solution to the situation in Venezuela lies in the creation of protectorates in the country, but rather in solutions conditions that respect the self-determination of the Venezuelan people within the framework of its constitution. The events of January 3rd transcend the regional sphere. The attack on the sovereignty of any country, regardless of the direction of its government, affects the entire international community. This and other cases of armed intervention against the sovereignty of a country, its territorial integrity, or its institutions must be vehemently condemned. It is up to this Council to assume its responsibility and react with determination, clarity, and obedience to international law in order to prevent the law of force from prevailing over the force of law. Brazil trusts that the future of Venezuela will be built by the Venezuelan people through dialogue, without external interference, and within the framework of international law. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
gracias por haber convocado
thank you for
a esta reunión
having
de emergencia del
convened
Consejo.
this emergency meeting of the
El
Council.
gobierno de México ha hecho
The government of
explícita
Mexico
ya
has already
su posición de
made
condena
its position
a la
clear with
agresión
regard to our
militar
condemnation
del
of the
pasado 3
military
de
aggression
enero
of January
contra
3rd
objetivos en
against
territorio de
targets in
Venezuela
the territory of
en
Venezuela,
clara
in
violación
clear
del
violation of
artículo
Article
segundo
2
de la
of
Carta
the
de las
Charter
Naciones
of the
Unidas.
United Nations.
Estas acciones
These
no
actions
deben
must not
permitirse,
be
pues
allowed,
constituyen
as
un
they
severo
constitute a
golpe
severe
a
blow
la Carta
to the
y al
Charter
multilateralismo.
and to multilateralism.
México quisiera
Mexico would
precisar
like to
los
clarify the
siguientes
following
4
points.
puntos.
4 points.
Número 1. La
Number 1,
proscripción
the
de la
prohibition
amenaza
of the threat
y el uso de la
of
fuerza
the use of
contra la
force
soberanía,
against the
la
sovereignty,
integridad
territorial
territorial
integrity,
o la
or
independencia
political
política
independence
de todo
of
Estado
any state
es el
is
fundamento
the
del derecho
foundation of
internacional,
international law,
sin importar el
regardless of
país
the
o el
country
gobierno de que
or
se
the
trate.
government involved.
2. La
2.
retórica que apunta
Rhetoric
hacia un
pointing
escalamiento
towards the
o
escalation or
expansión de las acciones
expansion of
militares,
military actions,
incluidos otros
including
países de
to
nuestra
other
región,
countries in our region,
amenaza la
threatens
estabilidad
regional
regional.
stability.
3.
3.
El Consejo de
The
Seguridad
Security Council
tiene la
has the
responsabilidad
responsibility
y sobre todo
and, above
la
all, it has
obligación
the
de
obligation
actuar de
to
manera
act
decisiva
decisively
y sin
and
dobles
without
estándares
double
ante
standards
violaciones
in
graves a la
face of
Carta
serious
y para
violations of
restablecer
the Charter
la paz y la
and
seguridad
to restore
internacionales
international peace and
en
security
estricto
in
apego
strict adherence
a lo
to the
dispuesto en
provisions
su artículo
of Article
24
24
y
and
observando
observing
el
Article
artículo 27, inciso 3.
27.3.
4.
4.
Corresponde a los
It
pueblos
is for
soberanos
sovereign peoples
decidir su
to
destino
decide their
y
destiny
encontrar
and to
soluciones
find
pacíficas,
peaceful,
democráticas y
democratic,
negociadas
and
a
negotiated
sus diferencias
solutions to their
políticas
political
en
differences
un marco de
within a
irrestricto
framework
respecto
of
a los derechos
unrestricted
humanos.
respect for human rights.
Los cambios de régimen
Regime
por
change
actores
by
externos
external
y la
actors
aplicación de medidas
and the application of
extraterritoriales
extraterritorial
no
measures
solo son actos
are not only
contrarios al
acts
derecho
contrary to
internacional,
international law,
sino que
but
históricamente
historically,
han
all
agudizado
they've done is
conflictos
exacerbate
y
conflicts
fragilizado
and
el
weakened
tejido
the
social
social
y
and
político
political
de las naciones.
fabric of nations.
Señor presidente,
Mr. President,
estimados colegas,
esteemed colleagues,
estimadas colegas, a pesar de las diferencias políticas
despite the
entre
political
nuestros
differences
gobiernos,
among our governments,
América Latina y el
Latin
Caribe
America and the
se ha
Caribbean
forjado
has been
como una zona de paz.
forged as a zone of peace.
Colectivamente hemos
Collectively,
recurrido
we
durante
have,
décadas
for
ya
decades now,
a los
resorted
mecanismos
to the
políticos y
available
jurídicos
political
disponibles
and legal
de
mechanisms
solución de
available
controversias.
in order to peacefully settle
La
disputes.
violación actual
The current
de este frágil
violation of this
equilibrio
fragile
pone
balance
en grave
gravely
riesgo la
endangers
estabilidad
the political
política
stability
y la
and
seguridad de la
the
región,
security of the region,
así como el
as well
bienestar
as the
de
well-being
nuestros
of our peoples.
Quienes justifican
Those who
estos
justify
actos
these acts
niegan la
deny the
historia
independent
independiente
history
de América
of Latin
Latina y el
America
Caribe.
and the Caribbean.
México,
Mexico,
firme en sus
firm
principios
in its
constitucionales de
constitutional
política exterior
principles of foreign
y
policy
su vocación
and its
pacifista,
pacifist
reitera
calling,
enfáticamente
emphatically
que el
reiterates
diálogo y la
that
negociación
dialogue and
son las
negotiation
únicas vías
are the
legítimas
only
y
legitimate
eficaces
and effective
para
ways
resolver
to
las
resolve
diferencias existentes.
existing differences.
Reitero
I
el llamado
reiterate
de la
the call
presidenta
of
de
the
México
President of Mexico
a que la ONU
for
haga
the
más
UN
por
to
solucionar
do
este
more
y
to
otros
resolve this
conflictos,
and other conflicts,
incluyendo a
including
través de
through the
gestiones
good
de su
offices of
secretario
its
general.
Secretary General.
Frente a los acontecimientos
In
del
view
pasado
of
3
the
de
events
enero,
of January 3rd,
México refrenda
Mexico
su disposición
reaffirms
de
its
apoyar
willingness to
cualquier
support
esfuerzo de
any effort
facilitación del
at
diálogo,
facilitating
mediación
dialogue,
o acompañamiento
mediation, or
que
providing
promueva la
assistance
paz
that
en la región.
promotes peace in the region.
Finalmente,
Finally,
no podemos pasar
we
por alto
cannot overlook
que
the
esta
fact
sesión del
that this
Consejo
session of the
se haya
Council
celebrado
has
hasta hoy,
been held only
cuando lo que
now,
tenemos ante
when what
nosotros
we
es
face
una grave
is a serious
situación que
situation
pone en
that
riesgo
puts
la paz
international
y la
peace
seguridad
and security
internacional.
at risk.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Paraguay.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
La delegación de la República del Paraguay
The
agradece a
delegation
la
of
presidencia
Paraguay
y a
would
los
like to
miembros
thank
del
the
Consejo
presidency and the
por
members
la
of the
oportunidad
council
de
for the
tomar la palabra
opportunity
en
to
esta
take the
sesión
floor
de
at
fundamental
this
relevancia.
very
El Paraguay
important
ha
session.
alertado sobre la deriva
Paraguay has
insostenible
already
de
pointed
Venezuela
out
bajo el mando de Nicolás Maduro,
the situation with regard to
cabecilla del
Venezuela under
cartel de los
President
soles,
Maduro and the
estructura
Cartel
criminal
de los
declarada
Soles and the
formalmente
criminal
como
organization
organización
that
terrorista
was
por
formally
las
declared as
autoridades
such by
nacionales y cuya persistencia
our
en el
national
poder
authorities,
representaba
and
una amenaza
his
para la
continued
región.
presence was a threat to
La
the
salida
region.
del líder de dicha
The exit of
organización
the leader
terrorista
of
debe
that
abrir
terrorist
paso de
organization should
inmediato a la
immediately
restauración
lead
de la
to the
democracia
restoration
y del
of
Estado de
democracy
Derecho en
and to
Venezuela,
the rule of law in
permitiendo que la
Venezuela,
voluntad
making
popular
it possible
expresada
for the
en las
popular
urnas
will
sea el
expressed
único motor de la
at the ballot
reconstrucción
box will
venezolana.
be the foundation for reconstruction in
En este sentido,
Venezuela.
hacemos también un enérgico llamado a
We
la
would also
pronta
urgently
liberación de
call
todos
for
los presos
the
políticos
release of all
que aún se
political
encuentran
prisoners
dentro de
that
las
are
cárceles
still
de ese
in
país.
the prisons of that
Reiteramos
country,
que el
and we
retorno a
reiterate
la
that a
institucionalidad
return to
democrática en
democratic
Venezuela y la posibilidad
institutions in
de que las
Venezuela,
autoridades
and the
legítimamente
possibility
electas
for the
asuman
legitimately
sus
elected
funciones
authorities to
constituyen
resume their
pasos
functions are
fundamentales para
fundamental
la
steps
estabilidad
for
de la región.
for stability in the region.
Finalmente, el Paraguay
And finally,
reafirma su
Paraguay
compromiso
reaffirms
histórico
our
con la
historic
resolución
commitment
pacífica
to
de
the
las
peaceful settlement
controversias,
of disputes,
observa con
and
atención el
we
desarrollo de los
would
acontecimientos
observe the
actuales en
current
Venezuela
events in
y alienta
Venezuela,
a priorizar
and
vías
we would
democráticas que
urge
garanticen una
democratic means to be given
transición ordenada.
priority for a
Nuestro
ordered
compromiso es y
transition.
seguirá
Our
siendo con
commitment
los
will
principios
continue to be to the
democráticos del
democratic
Estado de
principles.
Derecho.
Trade with the pearls definitely goes down to the basics so that you can understand the process of trading.
I thank the representative of Paraguay for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you,
Señor
Mr. President. Mr.
Cuba se
President,
adhiere a las intervenciones que
Cuba
realizará en
aligns
Eritrea en
itself
nombre
with
del Grupo de
the
Amigos en
statement to be
Defensa de la Carta de
delivered
las
by
Naciones
Eritrea
Unidas
on behalf of the
y
group of
Uganda
friends
en
of the
nombre del
United Nations
Movimiento
and
de Países
Uganda
No
on behalf
Alineados.
of the non-aligned
Desde
movement.
septiembre del pasado
Since
año,
September of last
Cuba ha
year,
venido
Cuba has been
denunciando los planes
denouncing the
hegemónicos y
hegemonic
criminales de
and
Estados
criminal
Unidos
plans of the
y
United
su proyección
States
agresiva contra
and
Venezuela y
its
la región. Hemos expuesto con
aggressive
claridad
projection
las
against
graves e
Venezuela and the
impredecibles
region.
consecuencias de la
We have
conducta irresponsable
clearly
del
been
gobierno de
exposed to
Estados
the
Unidos
serious and unpredictable
para la estabilidad
consequences of the
política,
irresponsible
social
conduct
y
of the US
económica de América
government
Latina y el
for the
Caribe
political,
y en
social, and
sentido
economic
general
stability of
para
Latin
la
America
paz
and
y
the Caribbean,
estabilidad
and more generally
internacionales.
for international peace
El
and
pasado
stability.
23 de diciembre
On the 23rd of
expusimos en
December,
este mismo
in
órgano
this very body,
la secuencia y la escalada
we
de
set
acciones
out the
llevadas a cabo
sequence and
por por Estados
escalation
Unidos en tiempo
of
récord
actions carried out
con
by
el
the
fin de
United
derrotar por
States
la fuerza al gobierno
with the aim
legítimo
of
y constitucional
overthrowing by
de
force the
Venezuela.
legitimate and constitutional government of Venezuela and destroying the civic and military union. The United States resorted to various maneuvers to materialize its plans for domination, including vile extrajudicial executions and acts of piracy, maritime terrorism against oil tankers and their crews in international waters of the Caribbean Sea, as well as the imposition of an illegal naval blockade against Venezuela and the politically motivated designation of its legitimate government as a foreign terrorist organization. Previously, it had subjected that country to prolonged unilateral coercive measures, economic asphyxiation, smear campaigns, and attacks against some of its important institutions, exposing it to a cruel psychological war. With absolute disrespect for the Charter of the United Nations and international law, including relevant resolutions adopted by this Council and by the General Assembly, on January the 3rd, United States military forces attacked Venezuela with total brutality and treachery, and in an unacceptable and barbaric act, kidnapped its legitimate president, Nicolas Maduro, and his companion Celia Flores. Cuba condemns in the strongest terms the military aggression of the United States against Venezuela, while categorically reiterating its absolute support and solidarity with the Venezuelan people, and joins the demand that the government of the United States release the constitutional president, Nicolas Maduro Moros, and his companion Celia Flores. In the criminal attack perpetrated by the United States, 32 Cubans lost their lives in combat actions. They were carrying out missions on behalf of the Revolutionary Armed Forces and the Ministry of the Interior at the request of counterpart bodies of that country. Our compatriots honorably fulfilled their duty and fell after fierce resistance in direct combat against the attackers or as a result of the bombings of the facilities. Through their heroic actions, they upheld the solidarity sentiments of millions of our compatriots. Mr. President, the cowardly U.S. aggression against Venezuela is a criminal act in violation of international law and the UN Charter. It constitutes a dangerous escalation of the sustained war campaign waged for years by the United States against that sister nation, which intensified since September 2025 with the aggressive naval deployment in the Caribbean Sea under mendacious pretexts and unfounded accusations without any evidence whatsoever. The U.S. military attack against Venezuela has no justification whatsoever. It does not respond to any provocation, nor does it possess legitimacy. It is based on the aberrant doctrine of peace through force and undermines the stability and peace that have characterized our Latin American and Caribbean region for years. It seeks to promote a change in the constitutional order of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, freely chosen by its people. Its ultimate objective is not the false narrative of combating drug trafficking, but control over Venezuela's land and natural resources, as has been openly and shamelessly declared by President Trump and his Secretary of State. This is an imperialist and fascist aggression with objectives of domination that seeks to revive the U.S. hegemonic ambitions over our America, anchored in the outdated Monroe Doctrine. It also seeks to intimidate and subjugate the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. Cuba calls for an urgent reaction from the international community against this criminal attack on Venezuela, a peaceful nation that does not attack the United States or any other country. We call on all governments, parliaments, social movements, and peoples of the world to condemn the U.S. military aggression against Venezuela and to confront this act of state terrorism that threatens international peace and security and seeks to impose a new doctrine of U.S. imperialist domination in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the world. Mr. President, the recent statements about imperialist plans to steer Venezuela toward a supposed safe, appropriate and prudent transition are totally unacceptable.
In the US vision of domination, this means imposing a puppet government functional to its predatory goals, particularly unrestricted access to and plundering of natural resources that, by right, belong to the Venezuelan people. Determining the destiny of Venezuela is an exclusive right of its people without external interference. If the US government, lacking any moral authority whatsoever, truly cared about the peace, freedom, and justice of Venezuelan men and women, it would not have bombed that territory with absolute disregard for the lives, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of that nation. I conclude by reaffirming our unwavering adherence to the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace, and by calling for action with the firmness and determination that current circumstances demand, always in defense of international law and of a future of peace for all the peoples of our America and of the world. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
América Latina
Latin America and the Caribbean is a zone of peace,
declarada por la Comunidad de Estados Latinoamericanos
declared by the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, on behalf of all of the peoples and governments of our region.
Esta zona de paz
This zone of
debe
peace
ser
must be
absolutamente respetada
fully
por todos los
respected
gobiernos del
by
mundo,
all governments
sin
of the world
excepción,
without exception,
y en especial
and in
por
particular
los miembros de
by
este
the members
Consejo de
of
Seguridad
this Security Council
responsable por la paz
responsible
y
for
seguridad
international
internacional.
peace and security.
Esta decisión,
This decision,
deseos y aspiraciones de
these
nuestros pueblos
desires and aspirations of our
son una
peoples
aportación noble
are a
a la
noble
paz mundial,
contribution to world peace,
al derecho
to international
internacional,
law,
a
and
la Carta
to the
de Naciones
United
Unidas.
Nations Charter.
Señor presidente, Nicaragua
Mr. President,
respalda lo
Nicaragua
expresado por la
supports
presidenta
what
interina de
was
Venezuela,
expressed by the interim
Delcy
president
Rodríguez,
of Venezuela,
que
Delcy
pide la
Rodriguez,
liberación inmediata
calling
del
for the
presidente
immediate
constitucional
release of the
y
constitutional
legítimo
and
de
legitimate
Venezuela,
president of Venezuela,
Nicolás Maduro Moro,
Nicolás Maduro
y la primera
Moros,
combatiente
and
de la patria,
the
Celia Flores.
first fighter of
Todos los
the
Estados miembros de
country,
Naciones
Celia
Unidas
Flores.
tenemos el deber
All
de
member states
respetar
of
el
the United
derecho
Nations
internacional,
have the duty to
el
respect
espíritu, los
international law,
propósitos y
the
principios
spirit,
de
the
la Carta
purposes
de
and
Naciones
principles of
Unidas,
the United Nations Charter,
el derecho a la
the
soberanía,
right to sovereignty,
autodeterminación,
self-determination,
integridad
territorial
territorial de los
integrity of
estados,
states,
la no injerencia, la
non-interference,
convivencia
and
pacífica.
peaceful coexistence.
El pueblo venezolano
The
es
Venezuelan
el pueblo
people
digno de Bolívar,
are
de
a
Chávez,
dignified
de
people,
Maduro,
the people of Bolivar,
e
of Chavez,
históricamente
and of Maduro,
indoblegable, que
and
defiende su soberanía
they have
y su
never
derecho a la paz.
bowed the knee.
Nicaragua
They defend their right to
siempre
sovereignty
estará con Venezuela.
and their right to peace. Nicaragua will always
La
stand with
paz ha sido
Venezuela.
profundamente
Peace
herida
has been
y la familia humana,
deeply damaged, and the
la
human
comunidad de
family, the
naciones,
community of nations,
los pueblos del
the
mundo,
peoples of the world,
urgimos que se reinstale
we urge all
como
of you
absoluto reflejo
to
de la dignidad de todos los pueblos. Muchas gracias.
respect the dignity of all peoples. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Nicaragua for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago thanks the Security Council for convening this urgent meeting following the recent developments in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. My delegation addresses this council today as a Caribbean nation, a neighbor of Venezuela, and a long-standing advocate for peaceful coexistence and the rule of law. The government of Trinidad and Tobago has taken note of the military operations undertaken by the United States in Venezuela. We remain committed to cooperative efforts led by the United States to disrupt and dismantle networks that enable transnational crime across the Americas, whose activities have had debilitating effects on the security and stability of the region. Trinidad and Tobago remains steadfast in its support of the United States of America's initiatives that strengthen regional security, reinforce the rule of law, and safeguard the well-being of our societies, the Americas. The government of Trinidad and Tobago, while valuing its long-standing and robust partnership with the United States, remains equally committed to maintaining a constructive and respectful relationship with the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and continues to uphold peaceful relations with the people of Venezuela. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to underscore its long-standing relationship with both the United States and Venezuela and stands ready to work collaboratively with all partners who share the aspiration of a safer, more prosperous and stable hemisphere. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank the representative of Trinidad and Tobago and now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Señor presidente, en primer lugar, me gustaría felicitarle por la asunción de la presidencia mensual del Consejo de Seguridad de Naciones Unidas y desearle todo el éxito en el desempeño de sus funciones. Agradezco la convocatoria de esta importante reunión y también transmito mi agradecimiento a la secretaria general adjunta y jefa del Departamento de Asuntos Políticos y Consolidación de la Paz de las Naciones Unidas, señora Di Carlo, por la información proporcionada en el día de hoy. España expresa su profunda preocupación por lo ocurrido en Venezuela, que, como ha señalado el secretario general de las Naciones Unidas, constituye un precedente muy preocupante con implicaciones para la región y para el mundo. El respeto a los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, en particular a la soberanía e integridad territorial de los Estados y a la prohibición del uso y amenaza de la fuerza es indispensable para garantizar la convivencia internacional. España defiende la vigencia de un orden internacional basado en reglas, donde resulta imperativo apostar, como recoge el artículo 2.3 de la Carta, por el arreglo pacífico de las controversias. Consideramos que estas acciones constituyen un precedente muy preocupante para la paz y la seguridad regional y recordamos que los recursos naturales del país son parte de su soberanía. Compartimos que la lucha contra el crimen organizado en la región es una prioridad, pero esa lucha solo puede hacerse mediante la cooperación internacional. Compartimos también que es prioritario defender los derechos humanos y las libertades públicas en Venezuela. España quiere trabajar por la paz, la estabilidad, la democracia, el progreso y la justicia social. Y eso no puede venir impuesto por la fuerza. Eso solo puede venir a través de un diálogo extenso entre venezolanos, con una solución venezolana pacífica y democrática, que sea la voz del pueblo venezolano la que marque el destino de Venezuela. España no reconoció el resultado de las últimas elecciones celebradas en Venezuela en julio de 2024 y ha sido contundente su condena de cualquier violación y amenaza a los derechos humanos. Ha dado protección a aquellos líderes opositores que han sido perseguidos y ha mostrado un firme rechazo a cualquier conducta antidemocrática y abuso contra la ciudadanía. Pero esta condena solo puede ejercerse desde el respeto a la legalidad internacional. España trabajará por unir a los venezolanos y venezolanas y apuesta por el diálogo y la paz, porque la fuerza jamás trae más democracia. Gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Spain, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to congratulate the Federal Republic of Somalia for assuming the rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council for the month of January, and wish you and your delegation all the best in the execution of your responsibilities. We also wish to thank you for convening this debate and affording all UN member states to participate, because the situation in Venezuela concerns all UN member states, given its implications for the credibility of the UN Charter and international law. Mr. President, integral to the maintenance of international peace and security since the establishment of the United Nations is the understanding that no nation can claim to be legally or morally superior to another. We are all nations born out of different histories and contexts, ascribing to the common values and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Chief amongst these principles is the sovereign equality of all its members. By signing the Charter, We have all committed to settle our international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace, security, and justice are not endangered. We have also committed to refrain in our foreign relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. The International Court of Justice has also previously affirmed that international law prohibits the use of force and intervention in another state's affairs. Due to the shortcomings of its predecessor, the League of Nations, the UN was created to prevent countries from resorting to conflict, to settle disputes and prohibit the use of force unless it is done in a legally prescribed manner. In doing so, the UN has played a pivotal role in ensuring peaceful existence amongst nations, including in ending the colonial subjugation by powerful countries over others, underpinned by respect for the equal rights of nations, large and small, and respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Joining the organization and committing to its principles afforded protection to many of us, with the supposed assurance that no longer would one nation be seen as inferior to another. Unfortunately, when countries ignore the Charter and act contrary to its central premise, it undermines the credibility of the entire system in which we all undertake our international relations. The stability